Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today we are going to be going behind the curtain on Confucius.
Ooh, interesting.
Yeah, so we are not tackling his famous philosophies. You've probably heard enough of that.
Yeah.
But instead we're going to be digging into his origin story.
His origin story.
Yeah, trust me, it's way more intriguing than your average history lesson. Think social claving and unexpected twists, but ancient China style.
Sounds juicy. I'm in. What are we talking about specifically? Like, what's the focus of this deep dive?
Well, we are going to be peeling back the layers of the wise sage image to reveal a more human and more complex Confucius.
Okay.
So this deep dive is about how someone born with the odds stacked against him navigated a rigid social system and rose to become an aristocrat.
Wow, that's quite a journey. So where do we even begin to unravel this story? What sources are we looking at?
Well, our guidebook for this journey is Simmer Can's Records of the Grand Historian.
Oh, okay.
It's like the source on Confucius.
Right.
But even this text has some head-scratching contradictions.
Really?
Especially when it comes to his parents.
Interesting. What kind of contradictions are we talking about?
Well, for example, the records use this phrase, wild combination, to describe Confucius's origin.
Wild combination. What does that even mean?
Right. It sparked endless debates among scholars.
Not bad.
Some think it implies something scandalous, you know?
Oh, I see. So like maybe his parents weren't married or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. But if we look closer, the reality is much more nuanced.
Okay, so let's dive into this wild combination mystery. What clues do we have?
Well, for a while, people pointed to Han Dynasty tomb art, which can be pretty, shall we say, open-minded,
I've heard about those. Pretty wild stuff.
as proof of a more liberated ancient society.
Ah, I see. So they were using those as like a parallel to Confucius's time.
Exactly.
But I'm guessing that interpretation doesn't quite hold up.
You got it. That interpretation misses the mark.
Why is that?
Well, first of all, those tomb scenes likely depict rituals or symbolic things,
Okay.
not everyday life.
Right.
And second, if we look at Confucius's birthday, traditionally celebrated on September 28th, that date was calculated backward from old texts.
Interesting.
The timeline just doesn't add up for a literal wild combination.
Okay, so if it's not literal, what does wild combination actually mean?
That's the million-dollar question, right?
Yeah.
What does it actually mean?
Mm-hmm.
Well, scholars have looked at the historical context
Okay.
and different interpretations, and a more plausible explanation emerges.
What is it?
It refers to relationships that were socially unacceptable back then,
Okay.
like extramarital affairs,
Okay.
or those that crossed class lines.
Ah, that makes sense.
Mhm.
Especially when you consider the strict class system during the spring and autumn period. You were pretty much stuck in the social class you were born into.
Exactly. You were basically born into your fate,
Right.
marrying outside your class.
Forget about it.
Forget about it.
But of course, I imagine relationships still happen regardless of those rules.
Oh, of course.
People are people.
These relationships existed, but they were kept hush-hush.
Right.
And they definitely couldn't lead to marriage.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So Confucius's parents were involved in a relationship that bucked social norms, making him a wild combination child.
So that explains why he grew up poor despite his father being an aristocrat.
You got it.
It really sets the stage for this incredible journey we're about to unpack, how he claimed his lineage and rose above his circumstances.
Exactly. And this completely changes our understanding of who Confucius was.
Yeah.
It reveals a side of him that's often overlooked. Let's meet Dad,
Okay.
Kong He,
Kongi.
a low-ranking nobleman. But imagine him like a Don Quixote type,
Don Quixote type.
dreaming of military glory, even though his reality was far from glamorous.
I can picture it. So do we know anything about his life? What kind of guy was he?
We actually get a glimpse of his adventurous life in the Huan,
Zuozwan.
another historical text.
Okay.
He was known for his strength and bravery on the battlefield,
Oh, wow.
pulling off some seriously heroic feats.
Sounds like he had some stories to tell.
Oh, yeah. And he even managed a small area called Chongping Township,
Chomping Township.
just outside the Lu state capital.
Okay.
This is likely where he crossed paths with Confucius's mother.
Makes sense. So tell me about Confucius's mother. Where did she fit into all of this?
Well, Confucius's mother lived in a village called Yanjiazhuang,
Yanjiazhuang.
where most people had the surname Yan,
Oh, interesting.
probably related.
Yeah,
And Kong, he was probably there on official business when they met.
that makes sense.
Yeah.
And that could explain why Confucius initially went by Yan Q, his mom's surname.
Exactly, instead of Kong Q.
It really highlights how deeply social constraints impacted his life.
Right.
He couldn't claim his father's name or status because of this taboo relationship.
Exactly. And if we look at the Analects, Confucius's own words, he talks about experiencing poverty as a young man,
Really?
even doing manual labor.
Wow.
It makes you wonder how this hardship shaped his later philosophies.
Absolutely. It seems like those early experiences, poverty, social stigma, they probably gave him a unique understanding of class, society,
Right.
and the human condition.
Right.
And maybe that influenced his thoughts on ethics, government, social harmony.
We have young Confucius labeled a wild combination, born into poverty, seemingly destined for a life far different from the one he ultimately led. But things took a dramatic turn when his mother passed away during his teenage years.
Okay.
This is where things get really interesting.
How so?
Instead of a typical burial for someone of their social standing, Confucius makes a decision that changes everything.
What did he do?
He decides to bury his mother in his father's grave.
Really?
A joint burial. The strange part,
What's that?
he claims he doesn't know where his father's grave is.
Wait, what? He doesn't know where his father is buried. That seems strange, considering his father was nobleman.
It's one of those contradictions that makes you question the historical record.
Right.
Would Confucius truly not know where his noble father was buried?
Yeah, I mean, wouldn't he have learned that from his mother or someone in the community?
You'd think so. And even if he didn't, couldn't he easily ask someone in the Kong family?
Yeah, you'd think they would know. Something's definitely not adding up here.
You're right. It seems unlikely he wouldn't have this information, which leads to a fascinating theory about his true intentions.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What's the theory?
His actions point toward a calculated strategy, a bold move to force the Kong family to acknowledge him.
Interesting. So he was using this burial as a way to get their attention.
Exactly. This whole coffin stop by the roadside, asking strangers for help finding the grave, it was a public declaration.
Like a public plea for recognition.
Designed to pressure the Kong family.
That's pretty clever. But it was a big gamble.
It was.
If they ignored him, they'd look heartless. But acknowledging him meant accepting a wild combination child into their prestigious lineage.
Big risk, big reward, right?
Yeah, exactly. But why would the Khan family even consider it? Why risk their reputation for someone outside their social circle?
To understand that, we need to consider the Kong family's situation at the time.
Okay.
Historical records are patchy,
Right.
but we get clues.
Like what?
Well, it's mentioned that Kong, his cousin, inherited the family name,
Okay.
suggesting a lack of direct male heirs.
Ah, so the Kong family might have been dwindling.
They might have been, making Confucius's claim suddenly attractive.
So they might have been desperate for a successor, someone to carry on the family name.
Precisely. The records of rights even mentions a mortician's mother,
Okay.
acting as a go-between for Confucius and the Kong family.
Oh, wow. So there were actual negotiations happening.
This suggests they were open to negotiation.
Okay, so Confucius created a stir, putting the Kong family in a bind. But public pressure alone wasn't enough.
He needed proof. He needed something concrete to back up his claim.
I see. Something undeniable. What did he have?
Well, he had one very compelling piece of evidence. His striking resemblance to his father.
Ah, like inheriting a family trait.
Both Confucius and Kong, he were described as exceptionally tall, towering over everyone else.
Interesting.
In a society obsessed with family traits, this shared physical characteristic would have carried serious weight.
It's amazing how something as simple as height could be so pivotal. In this case, it was almost undeniable proof of Confucius's lineage.
And against all odds, it worked.
It did.
The Kong family accepted him, allowing his mother to be buried with Kong Hill. This was a major turning point, catapulting him from the bottom rungs of society into the aristocracy.
That's incredible. Such a dramatic change of fortune. It just goes to show how much social mobility was possible during that period.
Well, not really. This kind of social mobility was incredibly rare in the spring and autumn period. It speaks volumes about Confucius's cunning and his ability to seize opportunities, maybe with a dash of luck thrown in.
I mean, he did have to have some luck on his side for this to work out. It's a pretty remarkable story. And it completely changes our perception of Confucius, doesn't it?
It really does. We think of him as the scholarly idealist, but this story reveals a shrewd, pragmatic side.
Right.
He knew how to work the system,
Yeah.
how to use social expectations to his advantage.
It highlights this fascinating duality within him. the blend of idealism and pragmatism,
Hmm.
which I'm guessing becomes a hallmark of his philosophy.
Exactly. Even his decision to pursue a joint burial for his parents, which wasn't common then,
Right.
shows this unique mix of traits.
It's like he was consciously crafting a narrative, solidifying his place in the Kong family, and ensuring society recognized his new status.
And this desire for recognition didn't end there. Even later in life, he continued to emphasize his Kong family connection. He did things like adding a mound to his parents' grave to make it more prominent.
Wow. So we see young Confucius not as someone passively accepting fate, but as someone actively shaping his destiny, navigating a complex social landscape, using his intelligence and awareness of social dynamics to overcome barriers and pull off a remarkable transformation.
It's like a real-life underdog story. He starts with everything against him, facing prejudice and societal barriers, but through clever tactics and a bit of daring, he manages to rewrite his own narrative.
And this transformation from a marginalized wild combination child to a respected member of the Kong family raises so many questions about what shaped his later philosophy.
Exactly. It makes you wonder how those early experiences, the challenges he faced, the strategies he employed, how all of that might have influenced his views on ethics, social order, and the role of the individual in society.
It's an intriguing thought. We're not just listing historical facts here, we're gaining a deeper understanding of the person behind the philosophy.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that becoming a nobleman was just the beginning for Confucius. He still had to prove himself within this new social circle, navigate the complexities of aristocratic life, and ultimately forge his own path.
It makes you wonder if this experience fueled his ambition, made him even more determined to succeed, to rise above the limitations of birth and social status.
We see hints of this drive in his later actions, his relentless pursuit of knowledge, his dedication to teaching, and his unwavering belief in the power of education to transform individuals and society.
It's certainly possible. And speaking of wild combination, let's take a closer look at that concept. Might sound strange or even offensive today, but it's crucial to understand it within the context of ancient Chinese society.
The spring and autumn period was all about social hierarchy. Your lineage determined your place. Marriage wasn't about love, it was about maintaining order, preserving bloodlines, and consolidating power.
So wild combination wasn't just a label. It was a social barrier that could severely limit a person's opportunities and potential.
And remember, it wasn't just extramarital affairs, it also included relationships that crossed class lines, like the one between Confucius's parents.
Exactly. This highlights an interesting tension in ancient Chinese society. The rigid rules around marriage versus the reality of human relationships that often ignored these boundaries.
This is why Confucius's story resonates even today. It's about overcoming adversity, challenging norms, and creating your own path themes that are universal and timeless.
It reminds us that history isn't just boring facts and dates. It's woven from human experiences, filled with triumphs and struggles, contradictions and complexities. By exploring these stories, we gain a richer understanding of ourselves and the world.
All right, so we've established Confucius as a wild combination child born into poverty and obscurity, but his mother's death presented a chance to change his fate. Let's dive deeper into that pivotal moment and his strategy.
The stopping the coffin tactic was brilliant. It was a public display of filial piety, a highly valued virtue in ancient Chinese culture. By claiming he didn't know his father's burial place, he put the Kong family in a moral dilemma.
They couldn't ignore him without looking cold and uncaring. Refusing to acknowledge him would have been a PR nightmare, damaging their reputation and potentially hurting their social standing.
Exactly. It was masterful social maneuvering, leveraging societal expectations to force their hand. But we should remember, this wasn't just about personal gain for Confucius. He also wanted to honor his mother, ensuring she had a proper burial beside his father.
It's that blend of pragmatism and idealism that makes him so compelling. He was ambitious, no doubt, but he was also guided by a sense of duty and a desire to do what was right.
And this duality is reflected in his later actions, too. Choosing a joint burial for his parents, a practice uncommon then, and later adding a mound to their grave to elevate their status and his connection to the Kong family.
It's almost like he was building a legacy, not just for himself, but for his parents, ensuring they were honored and their place within the Kong family was secure.
And this desire for a lasting legacy might have fueled his dedication to teaching and his belief in the transformative power of education to shape individuals and build a just and harmonious society. He might have seen his own journey, his own transformation, as proof of the potential of knowledge and self-cultivation.
It's incredible how his mother's death and his actions set off a chain of events with huge implications, not just for his life, but for Chinese thought and culture for centuries to come.
It all comes back to wild combination. This label, intended to marginalize him, ultimately became a catalyst for his rise, fueling his drive to challenge social norms and leave his mark.
It shows us that even labels meant to limit us can become sources of strength, pushing us to defy expectations and forge our own paths to success and fulfillment.
What's especially fascinating is that while Confucius successfully joined the Kong family, there's a curious silence in historical records about any interactions he had with them. We have detailed accounts of his relationships with his mother, his disciples, and various political figures, but there's a strange absence of information about his interactions with his father's side of the family.
That is a great point. You'd think there would be some mention of reunions, family gatherings, or even conflicts. It's as if once he secured his place within the Kong lineage, that chapter of his life was somehow closed off.
It makes you wonder, did he maintain a close relationship with the Kong family? Or was his acceptance more of a formality, a necessary step to legitimize his social standing, but not necessarily a deep personal connection?
It's a tantalizing mystery, one that historians have debated for centuries. Some speculate that he might have had strained relationships with his paternal relatives, perhaps due to resentment over his wild combination status, or even conflicts arising from his sudden elevation within the family hierarchy.
Others suggest that his focus shifted entirely towards his philosophical pursuits and his growing circle of disciples, leaving little time or inclination for familial ties. It's also possible that records of these interactions simply didn't survive, lost to time, or deliberately omitted from historical accounts.
Whatever the reason, this silence about his paternal family adds another layer of complexity to Confucius's story, a reminder that even the most detailed historical accounts inevitably leave gaps, unanswered questions that invite us to speculate, to fill in the blanks with our own interpretations.
And that's part of the allure of history, isn't it? The challenge of piecing together fragmented information, of grappling with ambiguity, and of acknowledging that we may never have a complete or definitive understanding of the past.
It's like solving a puzzle where some of the pieces are missing. We have to use our imagination, our knowledge of the historical context, and our own insights into human nature to create a coherent picture. And even then, we have to accept that there will always be aspects of the past that remain shrouded in mystery. But hey, that's what makes it so fascinating to explore, right? We're uncovering the hidden layers, the contradictions, the complexities that make history come alive.
Exactly. And in the case of Confucius, these hidden layers reveal a much more nuanced and intriguing figure than the one we typically encounter in textbooks. He was a master strategist, a social climber, a man who defied the odds and remade himself. But he was also a devoted son, a passionate teacher, a visionary thinker who believed in the power of virtue and education to transform individuals and society.
It's a story that continues to resonate today, reminding us that even in the face of adversity and societal limitations, we have the capacity to shape our own destinies and make a meaningful impact on the world.
It really makes you rethink that typical view of Confucius, right? Like it's just this, philosophical figure. He was also a master strategist, someone who understood the power of social perception. And he knew how to work within that system.
Yeah. He totally pulled off a real-life underdog story. He starts off with everything against him, facing those societal barriers and prejudice. But then he uses these clever tactics and a good dose of daring. And he ends up completely changing his fate.
It's amazing when you think about that transformation, right? From this wild combination kid to becoming a fully accepted member of the Kong family. It raises so many questions about what really influenced him, the stuff that shaped his philosophy later on.
I think that's what makes this deep dive so interesting. We're not just listing out historical facts, We're really trying to understand the man behind those famous ideas, the guy who lived these experiences.
Absolutely. And we can't forget that becoming a nobleman was just the beginning for him. It wasn't like, okay, I made it. Now he had to prove himself all over again within this whole new social circle. That world of aristocracy was so complex, and he still had to find his own path.
It makes you wonder if all of that fueled his ambition even more, right? Did he become even more determined to succeed, to rise above those limitations that people are born with?
It's definitely possible. You can see hints of that drive in everything he did later on, his relentless pursuit of knowledge, how dedicated he was to teaching, that strong belief that education could really transform people and society as a whole.
Let's shift gears just a bit. I think we should unpack this wild combination idea a bit more. I mean, that label sounds so strange, maybe even offensive to us today. But we've got to remember the context of ancient Chinese society to make sense of it.
Right? During the spring and autumn period, social hierarchy was everything. It decided your whole place in the world. And marriage. Marriage wasn't about love back then. It was this tool for maintaining order, preserving bloodlines, and holding on to power.
So being a wild combination, it wasn't just a label someone would throw around. It was a serious social barrier, something that could really limit a person's chances in life and hold them back from reaching their full potential.
Exactly. And it wasn't just about extramarital affairs either. It included any relationship that crossed those strict class lines. Like, remember, Confucius's parents couldn't officially marry because his dad was a nobleman and his mom was from a lower social class.
It's almost like you see this tension playing out, this clash between the super rigid rules about marriage versus the messy reality of human relationships. I mean, people don't always follow the rules, right?
And that's why Confucius's story resonates with people even thousands of years later. It's all about overcoming adversity, challenging those norms, and finding your own way. Those themes are universal no matter what time period you're in.
It reminds us that history isn't just a bunch of dates and names in a textbook. It's a tapestry of human experience, woven from real people's stories, and those stories are full of triumph and struggle, contradictions and complexity. It's by getting into those details that we understand ourselves and the world better.
Absolutely.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I think we have a much deeper and more complex view of who Confucius was. He's not just a wise sage spouting eternal truths. He was a real person who lived through some crazy times, dealt with a messed up social system, and used his experiences to create a philosophy that has impacted the world for centuries.
And even though we might never fully uncover all the mysteries surrounding his life, I think those unanswered questions just make him even more fascinating. It's a reminder that history is alive. It keeps changing as we find new evidence and reinterpret the past, looking at it through the lens of our own world.
Absolutely.
Today, we're diving straight into the early life of Confucius, a huge name, obviously.
Absolutely. Still resonates today.
And we're looking specifically at this really interesting period just after his mother's death. We've got some great source excerpts on this.
Yeah, it seems like a real turning point. He's starting to sort of navigate the aristocratic world of Lun.
Exactly. So our mission, if you like, for this deep dive is to get a handle on those first hurdles he faced. You know, how did he even start to find his place in this totally new social scene?
And it's fascinating because I think if you're interested in how big figures overcome obstacles, how they get the knowledge they need, well, Confucius's early story has some surprises.
Definitely some early struggles you might not expect.
Right. I mean, the image we often have is the wise old sage, right?
Yeah.
But his entry into the aristocracy, it was anything but smooth. He gets the title, changes his surname to Kong.
The official aristocratic name.
Right. But coming from a peasant background, through his mother, he was still very much an outsider. Adapting wasn't easy.
Okay, so let's dig into that. He gets the status, the name, the outward signs are there, but not quite enough.
Not really, no. And the sources highlight this key moment, this banquet, hosted by the Jasun clan.
Ah, the Jasun clan. We should probably explain. They were the real power players in Luoyang then, weren't they?
Totally. Basically running the show. A bit like, Cao Cao later on in Chinese history, holding all the real power.
So for Confucius, this new nobleman getting an invite, that's huge.
It's a massive opportunity, a sign he might actually be accepted.
And he even goes in mourning clothes, right?
Yeah.
Simple white belt, observing the customs after his mother died.
Exactly. It shows he's trying to do everything right. He's clearly anticipating this being a big step forward.
But then things don't quite go to plan.
Not at all. This is where Yang Hu comes in, another young nobleman, but maybe more established or just more aggressive.
And he confronts Confucius.
Pretty bluntly, according to the sources, he says something like, Jisun's hospitality this time is for Shu, not you.
Ouch. And she here means, like the proper nobles.
The insiders. That's the likely meaning, yeah. Basically saying, you're not really one of us. Directly challenging his status.
Wow. So how does Confucius react?
He just swallows his anger and leaves. What else could he do, really?
Yeah, I guess so. But it's more than just a personal snub, isn't it? It says something about that society.
Oh, definitely. It shows how rigid that spring and autumn aristocracy was. It was almost like a caste system. Birthright, especially who your mother was, matter immensely, more than just the title you inherited.
Which brings us to that question, and I bet you're wondering this too. Why wasn't the inherited title enough? His father was noble.
Exactly. And some later scholars, Tang Dynasty folks, they suggested maybe he was too young, like hadn't done the coming-of-age ritual at 20.
Okay, is there anything to that?
Probably not. Our sources lean towards dismissing that idea. Customs were a bit more flexible then, especially inheriting a title after a father's death. Plus, Yang Hu was likely around the same age anyway.
So it wasn't about age. What's the more likely reason then?
It really seems to come down to his mother's side, the maternal lineage.
Ah, okay.
His mother was a peasant, and crucially, not even a concubine, which would have still been lower status, but yeah, a peasant.
So in their eyes, impure blood.
That's the thinking, yes. Society put this huge emphasis on pure noble bloodlines, especially through the mother, kids of the main wife. Much higher status.
And wasn't Confucius's noble status only, formally recognized way later, after he died?
That's right, which just adds to this ambiguity about where he stood at this point in his life.
So Yang Hu's put down, it's rooted in these really strict social rules, and maybe a bit of rivalry between ambitious young guys.
I think that's a good way to put it. It's this clash within a very hierarchical system.
In this encounter, it seems like it really stuck with Confucius.
It definitely seems so. There's this Han Dynasty text, the Luoyang, that mentions Confucius apparently got nervous, even broke out in a sweat if he saw Yang Hu later on. Tried to avoid him.
Wow, so Yang Hu became this kind of imaginary enemy.
Yeah, like a lifelong rival, someone who maybe pushed him, fueled that drive to get recognition. That's a more interesting take than just seeing Yang Hu as the bad guy opposing the great sage.
Exactly. It shows how these personal setbacks, these difficult interactions can actually be powerful motivators. They can really drive ambition and self-improvement.
Okay, but here's a twist, isn't there? Their families weren't total strangers.
Not at all. And this is fascinating. Both the Kang family, Confucius's family, and Yang Hu's family were actually part of the same wider social circle.
Really? How so?
They were both connected to the Meng Sun clan, a really powerful, high-status clan in Luoyang.
Okay. And Yang Hu's connection?
His family was a more distant branch. Think of it like, in Dream of the Red Chamber, those distant relatives who share the name but aren't part of the core family's wealth or power.
Gotcha. A less prominent branch, but still connected.
Right. And the Kang family, Confucius's family, they were actually subordinate to the Meng Sun clan.
How do we know that?
Well, the sources mention Confucius's father serving in war under Meng Jianzi, who was a big figure in the Meng family.
Ah, okay. So it shows that feudal system in action. You have the big lords like Jisyun and Meng Sun, and then lesser nobles like Confucius's dad offering them service.
Exactly. It's that whole lord-vassal pyramid structure of the spring and autumn period.
So Yang Hu probably knew about Confucius's background, his mother's status, because of this shared network.
Very likely. They moved in the same circles, or at least their families did. Their fathers were, you could say, old colleagues and comrades through their ties to the Meng Sun clan.
So it wasn't just some random insult out of the blue. It was personal, based on knowing the family history.
Precisely. It came from within that intricate social web.
But it wasn't all bad, right? Did his father's network offer any help at all?
It did offer some advantages, yes. Confucius wasn't completely cut off. For instance, he became good friends with the son of Qin Jinfu, another associate of his father's, so there were some positive connections too.
Okay, so it's complicated. He gets this big rejection from Yang Hu, highlighting the barriers.
Yeah.
But he also has some existing connections through his father.
Exactly. And that whole experience, especially the Yang Hu incident, must have really hammered home the need for him to, learn the ropes.
Learn how to be an aristocrat.
Pretty much. His mom's family, being peasants, couldn't help him navigate courtly manners and rituals.
No, of course not.
And while his dad's network offered some links, it probably also just highlighted everything he didn't know.
So he urgently needed to become a, quote, qualified nobleman.
That's the challenge. He needed the cultural knowledge, the social graces, how to behave, everything.
Which leads us to the big question. How on earth did he learn all this stuff? Coming from his background, how did he get so knowledgeable?
And that's a question people asked even back then. His own disciples were curious.
Oh, yeah? What did they say?
Well, there's that famous bit from Zigong in the Analects. He says something like, the sage doesn't have one regular teacher. He learns from everyone.
If 3 people walk together, there must be a teacher for me. That's Confucius's own line, isn't it?
It is. And it fits perfectly. The sources basically confirm he didn't have formal schooling, no regular tutors. It was mostly self-study, learning from observation, asking questions.
Which makes sense given the options back then. What were the educational routes for nobles?
Well, those big court schools from the earlier Western Zhou dynasty, they were mostly gone by Confucius's time.
Okay, so what was left?
Mainly 2 things. family heritage and private education.
Family heritage.
Like
Knowledge passed down in the family.
Exactly. You had families who specialized in certain things, like the Shi families, the scribes, or historians. They'd pass that knowledge down generation to generation.
And private education.
That was tutors. High-ranking wealthy nobles could afford to hire private teachers for their kids.
But Confucius couldn't tap into either of those, could he?
Nope. His immediate family didn't have that kind of specialized knowledge legacy.
Right.
And he definitely didn't have the money for a tutor, especially when he was young and just starting out.
So he had to be resourceful. Sort of hitchhiking knowledge.
That's a great way to put it. Learning from any educated noble willing to share, watching ceremonies, asking questions, piecing it all together himself.
So when did he actually start this intense learning process?
Well, Confucius himself says in the Analects, at 15, I set my mind on learning.
15. That actually sounds kind of late, doesn't it, for someone who became Confucius?
It does seem a bit late compared to what you might expect, yeah. But then there's this other account from the historical records.
What does that one say?
It mentions him as a child playing games that involved setting out ritual vessels like Zhu and Du, mimicking ancestral ceremonies.
Okay. So was he learning from childhood, or did he start at 15? How do those fit?
Well, the 15-year-old mark is generally seen as when he started his serious, dedicated study. The childhood play, maybe it was more like a psychological thing. Growing up without a father, in a single mother home, he probably missed out on the usual family ancestral rites. So maybe playing with those ritual objects was a way for him to connect with that missing piece of his heritage. Unconsciously, perhaps?
Oh, that makes sense. And it fits with how important family ethics and rituals became for him later.
Exactly. But it wasn't formal learning. So it doesn't really contradict him saying he focused on learning from 15.
Okay. So compared to other aristocratic kids who grew up immersed in this stuff,
Yeah,
he did start relatively late.
he did. Which means he must have worked incredibly hard to catch up.
And we see evidence of that drive, right? Like that story about the temple visit.
Oh, yeah, the visit to the Imperial Temple of Lu. That's a great example.
What was the Imperial Temple, exactly?
It was the main ancestral temple for the rulers of Lu. Kind of like, well, maybe like a museum today, but a sacred one, displaying family artifacts and ritual items. Only nobles could go.
And Confucius went.
Yes, and apparently he was just relentlessly curious, asking questions about absolutely everything he saw. Non-stop questions.
Which didn't go down too well with everyone.
Not exactly. Other nobles there started criticizing him, like, who said this kid from Zhu knows etiquette? Look at him, asking about everything.
Kid from Zhu. Why Zhu?
Because his father had held a position in Zhu, which was a smaller state or area within Lu. It was a way of identifying him, maybe slightly dismissively.
Even though his mother was also from Zhu.
Yeah, but the nickname likely referred to his father's connection, highlighting that patriarchal focus again.
And how did Confucius respond to the criticism?
His defense was brilliant, really. He basically said that asking questions was the proper etiquette, that asking was how he was learning the correct Zhu rituals.
Ah. So he turned it around, acknowledging he was learning, but framing it as the right way to learn.
Precisely. It's an implicit nod to his non-standard background, but also a statement about his dedication to learning the right way.
And the fact they called him the Zhu man's child, that suggests he wasn't well known yet, right? Still just this young guy trying to figure things out.
Exactly. Later, he'd be known as Confucius, Master Kong. But here, he's still defined by his father's origin. It really shows his intense desire to learn, to absorb everything about this aristocratic world.
So, summing up this part, he basically had to teach himself.
Pretty much. The culture was monopolized by the aristocracy. He didn't have the family knowledge, couldn't afford a tutor.
Started late.
Started relatively late, yeah. So he relied on his own diligence, observation, and asking questions. Incredible self-reliance.
And that really sets the stage for what happens next, doesn't it? Which maybe we can get into in our next deep dive, his first actual job as a nobleman.
Absolutely. It's a crucial foundation. I mean, the key takeaway here is just how challenging his start was. It wasn't just handed to him.
Right. Social obstacles, that rejection from Yang Hu, which probably lit a fire under him.
Unexpected connections, too, through his father.
And this relentless, self-driven need to learn starting from behind. It's not the simple picture you might have had.
Not at all.
So maybe a final thought for you listening. Think about how often societal barriers and personal drive collide in the stories of influential people.
Yeah. What can we learn from Confucius's early days about adapting, about the sheer power of self-education, even when the odds seem stacked against you?
Something to reflect on. Maybe dig a bit deeper into the spring and autumn period, or just Confucius's early life. There's clearly a lot there. Going to be looking at the early life and career of Confucius,
Yes.
but not the Confucius you might find on those, like, inspirational posters.
Right, exactly.
This is going to sound a little different.
Yeah, we're diving into a lesser-known chapter of his life using this really interesting lecture transcript and some additional reading we did on the aristocracy of that era.
Okay.
And I think people will be surprised to find out what the revered philosopher's very first job was.
Okay, now you've got to spill the tea.
Okay.
We're talking about Confucius, the guy whose wisdom shaped Chinese thought for centuries.
Yeah.
What could be so surprising about his early career?
All right, so picture this China, 771 to 476 BC.
Okay.
A time of warring states, powerful noble families,
Yeah.
constant power struggles. Into this world enters a young Confucius, and his first job is a humble clerk managing warehouses and livestock.
Wait, hold up, a clerk. Like counting sheep and bags of grain. That doesn't exactly scream philosophical mastermind to me.
Right. It's a far cry from, that image we have of the sage dispensing wisdom from like a mountaintop.
Right.
But to really understand Confucius, we need to understand the world he lived in.
Okay.
So starting with the political landscape.
Okay.
Really powerful families called the Three Huan,
Okay.
who basically controlled the state of Lu.
So kind of like powerful mob bosses, but with better manners.
Well, not quite mob bosses.
Oh.
They were descendants of Duke Huan of Lu, and over generations, they divided the state's land amongst themselves.
Okay.
You had the Ji family, the Meng family, and the Shu family, each with their own power base.
Okay.
The Ji family held the most sway, followed by the Shu, and then the Meng, who were, let's just say, not having the best time.
Now this is where I need some serious clarification.
Okay.
Confucius had a connection to the Meng family.
Yes.
But instead of helping them out, he goes and works for the Ji clan, the top dogs.
Yeah.
What's up with that?
It's a move that really makes you think about ambition and loyalty in that era, right? Even his rival, a guy named Yang Hu, who also had ties to the Meng family,
Oh, wow.
chose to work for the Ji clan.
Okay.
So it seems like opportunity trumped family ties even back then.
Wow.
What does that tell you about the pull the Ji family had?
I mean, if even your rivals are jumping ship to join them,
Yeah.
they've got something going on.
Exactly.
But let's get back to Confucius and this junior clerk gig.
Okay.
We're talking ancient China here. What did that actually entail? Was he like an ancient accountant with a side hustle in animal husbandry?
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Think of it as being in charge of a large estate. He was responsible for keeping track of grain stores, managing the livestock.
Right.
Basically ensuring that this part of the Ji family's holdings was running smoothly. Not exactly the stuff of, like, philosophical debates, right?
Okay, I'm starting to see why this isn't the Confucius story everyone knows.
Right.
But I am genuinely curious. How would this kind of job have been perceived back then, especially for someone who'd later be considered a wise sage?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
You have to remember, this is a society obsessed with status and hierarchy. The sources contrast Confucius with someone like Ran Kui, who was born into the aristocracy.
Okay.
For Ran Kui, this kind of job would be unthinkable, almost insulting.
Wow.
But for Confucius, it might have been a different story.
So was he maybe seen as a bit of a trailblazer, someone willing to roll up his sleeves and get his hands dirty? Or would people have thought he was crazy for taking a job like that?
That's where things get really interesting.
Okay.
Actually, Confucius's dedication and success in this role.
Huh.
They talk about his meticulous record keeping and how the livestock thrived under his care.
Wow.
It seems like he took real pride in his work, regardless of what others might have thought.
Okay, so maybe there's more to this junior clerk thing than meets the eye.
Yeah.
But before we go any further,
Yeah.
I've got to ask about something I read.
Mm-hmm.
Wasn't there a whole controversy about Confucius supposedly becoming a high-ranking minister early in his career? Did historians get it all wrong?
Yes, the Sikong debate. This is where things get really interesting, and they show how archaeology can turn history on its head.
Okay.
So for centuries, scholars believe that Confucius had like this meteoric rise to power based on the writings of Sima Qian,
Okay.
the famous Han Dynasty historian. And he claimed that Confucius became the Sikong,
Okay.
which in Sima Qian's time was a powerful ministerial position.
So did Sima Qian just make stuff up? Was he trying to spice up Confucius's life story a little bit?
It's not quite that simple.
Right.
Remember, Sima Qian was writing centuries after Confucius lived. It's possible that the meaning of Sikong changed over time.
Okay.
But then in the 1970s, archaeologists unearthed something incredible, the sleeping tigerland kin slips.
Okay. These bamboo texts shed new light on the term Sikong, and guess what they revealed?
Don't leave me hanging. What did these ancient bamboo texts say?
The term Sikong wasn't just reserved for high-level government positions.
Okay.
It was also used for lower-level administrative roles, even within private estates, like the ones owned by the Ji clan.
Oh, okay.
So Confucius's Sikong role was likely much closer to his junior clerk duties than to a powerful minister.
So no overnight success story for Confucius.
Right.
Just good old-fashioned hard work and a healthy dose of accounting skills.
And this discovery really makes you think, doesn't it?
Yeah.
If Sima Qian misinterpreted this detail, what other parts of early Chinese history might need a second look in light of new archaeological discoveries?
That's a great point. History is always being rewritten as we learn more.
Exactly.
But to fully grasp what Confucius's early job meant for him, we need to understand the system he was working within.
Yes.
The lecture transcript calls it the military fief system.
Yes. And makes it sound like the backbone of the entire aristocracy.
You could say that.
Yeah.
It was the glue that held this complex social structure together.
Okay.
Imagine it like a set of those Russian nesting dolls, each one fitting inside the next.
Okay.
At the very top, you have the King of Zhu, the theoretical ruler of all under heaven.
But below him, things get a little more complicated, right? It's not
No.
like he was directly managing every little detail across the whole country.
Exactly. That's where the vassal lords come in.
Okay.
Think of them like powerful regional governors. They ruled individual states, and while they owed allegiance to the king, they had a lot of autonomy.
Okay.
They commanded their own armies, made their own laws, and were constantly jockeying for power and influence.
So kind of like mini kings within their own territories.
Yeah.
But they still had to answer to the big guy, right?
Absolutely. They owed military service to the king,
Okay.
meaning they were obligated to provide troops and support in times of war or conflict. It was a delicate balance between independence and loyalty.
And then we have the dafu, right? These are the high-ranking nobles who basically served as the vassal lord's right-hand men. Kind of like a cabinet, but with fancier rows and a lot more swords.
You could say that they received land grants from the vassal lords in exchange for their loyalty and military support. They also held positions of authority within their respective states, advising the rulers and wielding considerable influence.
Okay, so we've got the king vassal lords and the dafu. And then at the bottom of this aristocratic pyramid, we finally reach
Yes.
the shi,
The Shi.
which is where our friend Confucius comes in.
Exactly. The Shi were the rank and file of the aristocracy.
Okay.
They formed the backbone of the military forces and held various administrative and managerial positions, often serving the dafu directly.
So it's this intricate web of obligations and relationships that defines the spring and autumn period. But what's fascinating to me is that this whole system seemingly worked without a huge centralized bureaucracy.
Right.
Was it really that simple?
It's remarkable, isn't it?
Yeah.
Efficiency of the military fief system. There was no need for a complex administrative structure or a standing army.
Sure.
Each level of the hierarchy took care of itself, relying on personal loyalties and obligations rather than intricate legal codes or government institutions.
And the sources actually draw a parallel with the feudal system of medieval Europe,
Yes.
pointing out the similarities in social structures and how both systems relied on a relatively low level of social development to function.
Yeah, it's a great example of how seemingly disparate cultures can arrive at similar solutions to the challenges of governing large and complex societies.
And let's not forget the importance of titles in this system.
Right.
We briefly touched on the Kemeline, those elite officials chosen from among the dafu.
Yes.
These other titles for vassal lords, Gonhel, Bozinan, they sound more like ingredients for a mystical potion than actual titles.
You do.
What's the deal with those?
Those titles are a great example of how seemingly rigid social systems can have a surprising degree of fluidity and complexity.
Okay.
While there were some distinctions, these titles weren't strictly hierarchical.
So you're saying it wasn't as simple as saying one title automatically outranked another.
Right.
There was more nuance to it than that.
Exactly. The context to the individual's achievements and even their personal relationships with other nobles all played a role in how these titles were perceived and how they influenced social dynamics.
Okay, so it's not just about the name. It's about what you've done and who you know.
Right.
Sounds familiar.
Exactly.
But there's one title that clearly stood above all the rest. King.
Yes.
That one had to carry some serious weight.
Absolutely. King was reserved for the true ruler, the Son of Heaven, the embodiment of legitimate power. And this is where things get really interesting, because as the Zhou dynasty weakened, several vassal lords started calling themselves king.
Whoa. Talk about a power move.
Yeah.
That's like straight up challenging the authority of the king.
It was. It was a bold declaration of independence, a clear sign that the old order was crumbling and a new era of fragmentation and conflict was emerging.
Okay, so we've got a weakening king, ambitious vassal lords, and a whole lot of social and political upheaval.
Yes.
But there's one last piece of this puzzle. I want to understand the concept of reserved land.
Okay.
This wasn't part of the fief system, right?
That's right. These were lands held directly by the king of vassal lords, and even the dafu providing them with independent sources of revenue and resources.
Okay.
The sources point out that the decline of the Zhou kings was directly tied to their loss of control over these reserved lands.
So it wasn't just about military power or fancy titles.
Right.
It was also about who controlled the purse string.
Exactly.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
But how did all of this impact our friend Confucius, the humble clerk, working for the powerful Ji clan? That's what we need to unpack next.
Yeah. Well, you have to remember that Confucius wasn't working for just any branch of the Ji family.
Right.
He was working directly for the head of the clan,
Okay.
a young man named Ji Sunsai,
Whoa.
who took over leadership when Confucius was about 17.
Okay, now that's interesting.
Yeah.
Two young guys, both in positions of authority, navigating this crazy world of warring states and shifting alliances.
Right.
Kind of makes you wonder what their relationship was like.
Yeah.
Was it a mentorship, a rivalry, or just two ambitious guys trying to make their way in the world?
I wish more juicy details about their interactions.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, they focus more on the big mixture stuff.
Yeah.
What we do know is that this Ji Sunsai guy was known for being pretty ruthless and ambitious.
Which probably means Confucius had to be pretty sharp
Yeah.
to navigate that kind of environment.
Right.
I mean, remember, we were talking about the guy who would later preach about ethics and moral leadership.
Exactly. It really makes you think about how his early experiences might have shaped his later philosophy.
Right.
Imagine, instead of being surrounded by scholars and philosophers, he's dealing with shrewd politicians, power struggles, and maybe even some shady dealings.
Talk about a real-world education.
Right.
It's a side of Confucius we rarely get to see.
Yeah.
But I'm still stuck on this junior clerk thing.
Okay.
What would a typical day have looked like for him? Was he literally counting sheep and measuring grain?
Well, I'd imagine he probably had assistants to help with the day-to-day stuff.
Right.
So yeah, maybe he was spending time in storehouses, making
Yeah.
sure the accounts were accurate
Right.
and the grain was properly stored. And then there's the whole livestock management side of things.
Okay. I'm trying to picture Confucius out in the fields overseeing the shearing of sheep
Right.
or negotiating the price of oxen.
Yeah.
It's definitely not the image most people have of him.
It's almost comical when you think about it.
It is.
But remember, this was a rural society. Agriculture was the backbone of the economy.
Right.
And managing those resources effectively was crucial.
So maybe this unglamorous job actually gave Confucius a deep understanding
Yeah.
of how things really worked, the importance of hard work,
Right.
and the value of everyday people.
Precisely. It's a perspective you don't get from just reading scrolls and debating philosophy.
Right.
He was directly involved in the lives of farmers, laborers, and artisans. He saw firsthand how their work contributed to society and the challenges they faced.
It's almost like an ancient internship in social dynamics.
Right.
It makes me wonder if those experiences planted the seeds for his ideas about social harmony and the importance of ethical leadership.
It's a compelling thought, isn't it?
Yeah.
Maybe seeing those everyday struggles and the impact of decisions made by those in power fueled his desire for a more just and harmonious society.
It's a far cry from the image of a philosopher coming up with these profound ideas in isolation.
Right.
This is Confucius getting his hands dirty, literally, and seeing the world from the ground up.
And it's a perspective that's often missing when we talk about great thinkers.
Yeah.
We tend to focus on their finished works, the polished theories,
Right.
and the grand pronouncements.
Yeah.
But we forget that they were also shaped by their experiences, their struggles, and their interactions with the world around them.
It makes you wonder what other hidden gems might be lurking in the historical record,
Yeah.
waiting to be uncovered and challenge our assumptions about famous figures.
Exactly.
We dove deep into the complex social and political structures of the spring and autumn period, a time of warring states and shifting alliances, and we explored how Confucius's early experiences, especially his time as a junior clerk, might have influenced his later philosophical ideas.
It's been a fascinating journey, and we've only scratched the surface. There's so much more to discover about this era and the life of Confucius.
Totally.
Yeah.
But for now, we'll leave you with one final thought to ponder. Considering everything we've discussed today, how do you think Confucius's humble beginnings and his firsthand experience working with everyday people might have shaped his vision of an ideal society, a society based on ethics, social harmony, and the importance of virtuous leadership?
It's a question worth pondering as you continue to explore the fascinating world of ancient China and the enduring legacy of Confucius.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you found it enlightening and maybe even a bit inspiring. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning. So today we're going to take a look at something I know a lot of you have been wanting to know more about, which is the family life of Confucius. We have this really great excerpt from an academic lecture, and they really go into the social context of his time, which I think will really help us understand all of this.
Yeah.
And the thing is, even with all this research, scholars have done a lot of work on this.
Right.
There's not a lot of information out there about his wife and son.
Yeah.
It's sort of a historical mystery.
Really is.
It's like a puzzle with missing pieces.
Yes.
But what we do have is really interesting.
Yeah.
Because some of it kind of goes against what people commonly think about Confucius.
Right.
So that's what we're going to look at today.
Okay.
So most people know about Confucius the philosopher, but not a lot is known about his personal life.
Right.
Especially his wife. It's like history just decided to focus on his teachings and his travels, and his family kind of got left out.
Yes. It's very strange, isn't it?
It is. It's so weird.
We have these detailed accounts of every conversation he seems to have had with rulers and disciples.
Right.
And then when it comes to the wife...
Nothing. Crickets.
Yeah. It's so strange.
Yeah.
So this excerpt that we have...
Yeah.
goes into some of the claims that are out there. And what's amazing is that we can learn a lot by what's not said.
That's right.
So, for example, one source is this Confucian Analects of Confucius from the Three Kingdoms period.
Okay.
And they say that Confucius's wife was from this noble family named Huan in the state of Song.
Okay.
Sounds plausible at first glance.
It does, yes.
But when you look at it, and you dig a little deeper into the social customs of the time.
Right.
During the spring and autumn period, when Confucius lived, that claim starts to fall apart a little bit.
Sure.
Because back then, imagine the society where marrying someone with the same last name as you, even if you weren't closely related, was like a huge no-no.
Think of it like instead of just avoiding marrying your immediate family, you had to consider your entire extended clan.
Wow.
Going back like generations.
Okay.
And this was called no marriage between people of the same surname.
I see.
It was like one of the most important parts of their social structure.
Okay, interesting.
So even if you weren't really that closely related, just having that same ancestral surname was a total deal breaker.
Wow.
So that's where the Analects claimed it doesn't really make sense because Confucius and the nobility of the state of Song share the same ancestral surname.
They did?
Z.
Z.
So you'd have been like a major social taboo for them to intermarry.
I see.
So it's like trying to solve a riddle where the answer just doesn't fit the rules of the game.
Yes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And remember, this is when Confucius is like in his early 20s.
Okay.
He's just starting out as a low-ranking official. He's not the famous sage that he becomes later on.
Right.
So it's unlikely that he would have had like the social status to marry into a noble family.
I see.
From another state.
Okay.
Especially with these really strict marriage customs.
Yeah.
So when you look at it that way, that account in the Analects is kind of questionable.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
So if she wasn't from this noble family, then who was she?
Right.
And the lecture makes this point that maybe the lack of information itself is a clue.
Oh, that's interesting.
So think about it. If Confucius's wife was from a prominent family,
okay,
wouldn't there be some record of her lineage?
Yeah, that makes sense.
So the fact that there's silence surrounding her suggests she was probably from a more ordinary background.
Right.
Maybe even connected to his mother's side of the family.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So perhaps someone from the Yan village area
Exactly.
where his mother was from?
Yeah, someone whose family history wasn't considered important enough to actually write down.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you think about the social dynamics of that time. It was way more common to marry within your social circle, especially through like family connections,
Right.
than to try to find like a high status match from outside your community.
Yeah, that makes sense.
It's a good reminder that even someone like Confucius, who we sort of think of as almost this like mythical figure,
Right.
was still a product of his time.
Absolutely.
Like he was living within the same social structures as everyone else.
Right. And that brings us to another really interesting part of Confucius's family life, which is his son, Kong Li.
Kong Li.
You might be familiar with the literary allusion Tao Pei Li Dui,
Oh, right.
which refers to this carp that was given to Confucius.
Right. Yeah, I remember hearing about that.
Yeah, so the story goes that the Duke of the state of Loom gave Confucius a carp as a gift.
To celebrate Kong Li's birth.
Exactly, to celebrate his son's birth.
Okay.
But I have a feeling this story might have some layers to it.
Yeah, I was going to say.
Just like the account of his wife.
I bet.
You're picking up on something really important here. Remember at the time of Kong Li's birth, Confucius was just a junior clerk in the Jisun family.
Okay.
So like a low-ranking official.
Right.
So we have to remember his social standing when we're thinking about these historical stories.
Right. And speaking of social standing, there's also that story of Yang Hu,
Yes.
who was another clerk, and he openly questioned Confucius's abilities.
He did.
So this makes it seem like Confucius wasn't super respected by everyone at that time.
Yeah.
Especially not to the point where the Duke would send him like a personal gift.
Right. It seems a little unlikely, doesn't it? So it's
Yeah.
much more believable
Yeah.
that this carp was a gift from the head of the Jisun family, Confucius's employer.
Right.
Maybe just like a gesture of goodwill to someone who works for them.
Okay.
And then as Confucius becomes more famous over time,
Right.
the story might have been embellished
I see.
to kind of elevate his status.
Right. To make him seem more important.
Exactly. And to imply a closer relationship with the Duke than there actually was.
Okay. So it's like historical telephone.
Yes.
Where the story changes a little bit each time it's told.
Precisely. But that doesn't mean the story has no meaning.
Right.
The carp, even if it wasn't from the Duke, still has this symbolic weight.
Okay.
It shows how important gift-giving was in ancient Chinese society.
Right.
Even seemingly simple gestures carried a lot of social and political meaning.
Okay.
And then there's how Confucius chose to name his son.
Right. He named him Li.
Yes, after the carp.
So at first glance, it seems like a simple detail,
Yeah.
even kind of quirky,
Mm-hmm.
but I bet there's more to it.
Oh, there's always more to uncover.
Okay, tell me.
Naming his son after the carp, regardless of where it really came from, was likely a really smart move on Confucius's part.
You mean like a way of showing respect to his superiors in the Jisun family?
Exactly, like saying, hey, I appreciate this gesture, I'm loyal to you.
Right.
And that kind of thing would have been really valuable for someone like Confucius, who was navigating this complex social hierarchy.
And trying to climb the ladder.
So it's like a subtle form of social strategy,
Exactly.
hidden in a simple act of naming his son.
That's right. It's amazing how these little details
Right.
can tell us so much about power and ambition in that time.
Yeah, it really is fascinating.
It is.
Makes you think.
It does.
What else is hidden in history?
Yeah, what other stories are waiting to be told?
Exactly, and maybe we'll find some of those
Maybe we'll.
as we keep going through this material.
Okay,
So let's take a quick break.
sounds good.
And when we come back, we'll continue our deep dive into the fascinating world of Confucius.
I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, it really does make you appreciate how complex history really is. I mean, we think about these figures from the past, and it's easy to think of them as almost mythical.
Right.
But they were real people, you know, making decisions within these really specific social structures.
Yeah.
And even something like naming a child could have these ripple effects that we might not even think about. Absolutely. And that's why I think this deep dive into Confucius's family life is so fascinating.
Yeah.
It gives us this much deeper understanding of the man behind the philosophy.
Right.
It's like we're peeling back layers of time to see him not just as the sage,
Right.
but as a husband, a father, a member of a community,
Right.
dealing with all these social complexities that everyone else was facing.
And it makes you wonder what other choices in his life might have been influenced by those social dynamics.
That's a great question. It really is, and it takes us back to Confucius's pragmatism,
All right.
which seems to have been like a defining trait for him.
Right.
Even in his early years, I mean, think about it, the spring and autumn period, that was a time of huge upheaval and political intrigue.
Yeah, not exactly a peaceful time.
No, not at all. And for someone like Confucius, who
Yeah.
was born into this declining noble family,
Right.
social mobility wouldn't have been just a personal goal.
Right.
It would have been vital for survival.
So making a good impression on powerful people would have been super important.
Yes, even through these small gestures.
It makes the mystery around his wife even more intriguing.
Yes, it does.
If she was from a more humble background.
Which seems to be the case.
Like the evidence suggests then, her life and her experiences
Right.
might not have been considered worth recording by the historians at the time.
That's a really good point.
It's a reminder that history is often told from the perspective of the elite.
It really is.
We don't often get to hear the stories of everyday people, especially women, in these ancient accounts.
Right. Their voices are often lost.
Yeah, it's like they just disappear.
And that's why it's so important to examine those silences in the historical record,
Yeah,
to look for those missing voices and try to piece together their stories.
it's like being a detective,
Yeah.
but for history.
Absolutely searching for clues to bring those forgotten lives into focus.
And maybe those gaps in the historical record, those silences, maybe they're the most interesting parts of the puzzle.
In a way, they are, because they force us to ask questions, to dig deeper,
Yeah.
to consider perspectives that might have been overlooked.
So what does all this mean for someone listening today?
Right. What's the takeaway?
Why should these details about Confucius's family life matter to us centuries later?
I think it comes down to this: by understanding the social context of his time and the complexities of his personal life, we get a much richer understanding of his philosophy.
Yeah, it's like we can see his teachings not just as these abstract ideas,
Right.
but as the product of a real person
Absolutely.
who is dealing with the same challenges and aspirations as people throughout history.
Exactly. It humanizes him
It does.
in a way that just reading his philosophical texts might not.
Yeah, you see him not just as this wise sage,
Right.
but as a husband, as a father, as a part of his community,
Mm-hmm.
trying to make his way in the world.
Yeah, and by seeing that,
Yeah.
by recognizing his humanity,
Mm-hmm.
we can approach his teachings with this whole new perspective. We can appreciate not just his words, but the life experiences that shaped them.
Right. It's like realizing that even the greatest thinkers
Yes.
are influenced by the world around them.
Absolutely, by their relationships, their struggles, even the smallest decisions.
And by understanding that context,
Right.
we can understand his ideas better,
Yeah, and how they might still be relevant to our lives.
even all these centuries later.
It's a good reminder that even though we're separated by time and culture,
Mm-hmm.
we share this common human experience.
How about you?
And learning about people like Confucius
Yeah.
helps us connect with that.
It's like we're all part of this big story,
Rare.
this grand narrative of what it means to be human.
And it encourages us to keep asking questions,
Right.
to challenge our assumptions,
Yeah.
and to look beyond the surface, because there's always more to discover.
Exactly. Wow. It's like we've been on this amazing archaeological dig, right?
I know.
Brushing away the dust of centuries to see these little glimpses into Confucius's life.
Yeah, and they're not insignificant.
Right. And the thing is,
Yeah.
they don't take away from his story.
Yeah.
If anything, they make it more interesting,
They do.
more real.
They make him seem more human.
Exactly.
Instead of this distant figure,
Right.
they show us Confucius as a man of his time.
Yeah.
Someone who had to deal with the same social pressures as everyone else.
Right.
You know, he had to navigate this complex hierarchy.
Mm-hmm.
But even within all of that,
Right.
he was still able to develop this philosophy.
Right. These ideas that have lasted for thousands of years.
It's amazing.
Really incredible.
It is.
And it makes you think
Yeah.
that big ideas don't just come out of nowhere.
No, they don't.
They come from lived experience.
Right. They're forged in the fires of real life.
Right. So maybe all of Confucius's teachings about family,
Yeah.
about social harmony,
Right.
about leadership,
I
maybe they were at least partly shaped by his own experience
think so.
as a husband, as a father,
Yeah.
as someone trying to figure out how to succeed in the world.
Absolutely. And that brings us back to why it's so important
Yeah.
to understand the historical and personal context of
Yeah.
any idea.
Right. Because it's not just about what someone said or wrote.
No, it's not.
It's about who said it,
Right.
why they said it,
Yeah.
what was going on in their life.
Exactly what influenced their thinking.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive into Confucius's family,
Yeah.
what's like the one thing
Right.
you want our listeners to remember?
I think the big takeaway here
Yeah.
is the importance of questioning assumptions and really digging beneath the surface. Just because a historical narrative has been around for a long time
Right.
doesn't mean it's not open to questioning or reinterpretation.
Right. It doesn't mean it's necessarily true.
Exactly. We have to be willing to look beyond the accepted versions of history
Right.
and consider other perspectives.
So be critical thinkers.
Yes, be curious.
Ask questions.
Yeah, don't just take things at face value.
Exactly.
And as you continue to learn about Confucius and his teachings, think about what do these glimpses into his family life?
Right.
His pragmatism, his ambition.
Yeah.
What do they reveal about him as a person?
Okay.
And how might that have shaped his philosophy?
It's a great question to think about.
It is. And who knows, you might discover something new.
Maybe even about ourselves.
Right, because in a way, history is a mirror.
It is.
It reflects not just the past, but also who we are.
Okay, so thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Yes, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
And we'll be back soon to explore another fascinating corner of history.
All right, so we're diving deep into the life of Confucius today, and we've got these excerpts from a lecture that are really fascinating, focusing on a period you might not know as much about his early career, before he became like the Confucius, the philosopher.
Yeah, exploring those early years, I think, gives us a much deeper understanding of how his ideas actually developed.
Right.
And his real impact on society.
Exactly.
Because he wasn't, born a legend, right?
Yeah.
He became one.
He became one. And I think we tend to picture him as this wise, older sage.
Right.
But he had a whole life leading up to that.
Exactly.
And our source material takes us back to like his 20s and 30s working as a clerk. Not exactly the image of a world-changing philosopher, is it?
Not at first glance, no.
Right.
But this is where we start to see, I think, the seeds of his greatness.
Yeah.
Confucius was a keen observer.
Yeah.
And he noticed a need.
What need did he notice?
Well, many rural people in his area lacked basic skills.
Okay.
Needed for better jobs.
Right.
And, instead of just seeing a problem, he saw an opportunity.
Yeah, it's so fascinating how he recognized that and decided to address it.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just about like personal ambition, was it?
I don't think so.
Like, was there something more driving him?
Absolutely.
What do you think it was?
Well, Confucius really believed in the power of education to uplift individuals and to strengthen society as a whole.
Okay.
And he saw this gap in practical skills as a barrier
Yeah.
to social mobility. Something he felt deeply about.
So he starts his own school.
Right.
Well, it's more like a practical training program.
That's a better way to put it.
What I find so fascinating here is the tuition.
Oh yeah.
Our source mentions it was a bundle of dried meat.
That's right. Yeah.
What does that tell us?
I mean, that speaks volumes, I think, about Confucius's commitment
Okay.
to making education accessible.
Yeah.
It wasn't about profit for him.
Right.
It was about sharing knowledge and empowering people,
Okay.
regardless of their economic background. So in a way, he was kind of challenging that existing social hierarchy,
Right.
where opportunities were often limited, by birth.
Yeah, it's a powerful reminder that education can be a great equalizer.
Right. Absolutely.
But it also sounds like he was strategically building his own network. Our source mentions that he often trained his students,
Yeah.
many of whom were relatives, to be potential assistants.
Right. He was definitely a shrewd operator.
Right.
By equipping his students with valuable skills. He was not only helping them to advance, but he was also creating a network of loyal and capable individuals.
Yeah.
Who could support his own work and ambitions.
So he's not just teaching, he's building a team.
He's building a team.
But this raises an important question. Wasn't there like a rigid social hierarchy in ancient China?
Yeah.
Was he subtly challenging that by teaching those who were typically excluded from education?
That's a great point.
Right.
You're hitting on a key point here.
Yeah.
Confucianism,
Yeah.
from its very beginnings, really promoted the idea of meritocracy, that advancement should be based on ability and virtue,
Right.
not just birthright.
Yeah.
And by offering education to those who are typically overlooked,
Yeah.
Confucius was putting this principle into action,
Right.
planting the seeds of social change.
It's amazing to see how these early experiences really shaped his philosophy and his impact on the world.
Yeah.
But his story doesn't end there.
Right.
Our source mentions that all this hard work
Mm-hmm.
and this innovation gets him noticed by a powerful nobleman.
Yes.
Meng Shixi,
Right.
head of the Meng Sun clan. This is a pivotal moment.
Yeah, this is a pivotal moment.
Think of it like catching the attention of a Fortune 500 CEO today.
Yeah, exactly.
Confucius is hired as a tutor for Meng Shixi's sons, bringing him into the elite circles of Lu.
Exactly.
It's a huge leap forward in his career.
Yeah, absolutely.
But this detail about the Meng family is interesting.
Right.
They had a history of accepting children born outside of traditional marriages.
Mm-hmm.
Could this have made them more open
Possibly.
to someone like Confucius,
Yeah, that's definitely a possibility.
who didn't come from a purely aristocratic background?
I mean, the Ming family's values
Right.
might have aligned with Confucius's own belief in merit
Okay.
and individual worth, regardless of social standing.
Right.
It's a reminder, I think, that open-minded individuals and families can create opportunities for those who might otherwise be excluded.
And from this point on, Confucius's journey takes an even more fascinating turn.
That's right.
He embarks on his first trip abroad, accompanying his student to Luoyang, the capital of the Eastern Zhou dynasty.
Right.
And what's striking is that this is the first time he leaves his home state of Lu.
Yeah, it's a major life event for him.
Right.
And we even know the exact date of this journey.
Really?
Thanks to some historical detective work.
Oh, wow.
Historians were able to use records of a solar eclipse
Oh, wow. That's incredible.
to pinpoint the year and even the month of his departure.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
But this trip wasn't just like a sightseeing tour, was it?
No, not at all.
They had a specific purpose, right?
Absolutely.
What was it?
They were traveling to Luoyang to report the death of Meng Shixi
Okay.
to the royal court.
Right.
A duty that blended politics and family obligation.
Mm-hmm.
And while we don't have his personal diary from this period, we can imagine the impact this journey must have had on him.
Yeah.
I mean, Luoyang was a melting pot of culture and ideas.
Right.
A far cry from his home in Luoyang.
It's as if he's stepping onto a larger stage, encountering new perspectives and challenges.
Mm-hmm.
And what's fascinating is that he doesn't return from this journey empty-handed.
No, he doesn't.
Our source mentions a very special gift.
Yeah.
He receives from the Meng family his very first carriage.
Yeah, this wasn't just a mode of transportation. This was a symbol of status and mobility in ancient China.
Right.
Imagine the feeling of getting your first car today.
Right, exactly.
This carriage represented a significant
Yeah.
step up in the world for Confucius.
It's easy to get caught up in the excitement of the carriage, but I think it's worth pausing here to consider what it really represents.
Right.
It's not just about material possessions, is it? No. Like what does this gift symbolize for Confucius's journey?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. The carriage represents his growing influence.
Right.
His expanding network and the opportunities that are opening up to him as he ventures beyond his familiar surroundings.
Right.
It's a physical manifestation, I think, of his upward trajectory.
Yeah.
In a way.
Mm-hmm. We left off with Confucius receiving this incredible gift, this carriage, a symbol of his rising status and the opportunities that were opening up to him. But this trip to Luoyang was more than just a chance to climb the social ladder, wasn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
Like, what else was he doing there?
I mean, Confucius wasn't just there to, just to perform a duty. He was eager to learn.
Right.
And to soak up everything that this new environment had to offer.
Mm-hmm.
He was like a sponge.
Yeah.
Absorbing new ideas, meeting influential people.
Right.
Remember, Luoyang was the capital of the Eastern Zhou dynasty. It was a hub of culture and politics.
It makes you wonder what it must have been like to witness those discussions firsthand.
Yeah.
What kinds of things were people talking about back then?
Yeah.
Was it all tortly gossip and political maneuvering?
I'm sure there was plenty of that.
Right.
But the issues of the day went far deeper.
Okay.
One of the biggest concerns was the declining power of the Zhou dynasty.
Okay.
You know, for centuries, the Zhou kings had been the symbolic rulers of China, but their authority had weakened.
Okay.
The various states were becoming more independent,
Right.
and were often at war with each other.
So it's like this backdrop of political fragmentation and instability is shaping Confucius's experiences. And for someone who valued order and harmony,
Right.
this must have been deeply concerning to him.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, he was witnessing the breakdown of the very system
Yeah.
that he believed in. And it forced him to confront this question of how to restore order
Okay.
and create a more just and harmonious society.
If we connect this to his philosophy, is this where his emphasis on Ren starts to take shape? This idea of benevolence, or of putting the needs of others before your own as a way to heal those divisions.
That's a very insightful connection.
Yeah.
While Ren was always a part of his thinking,
Yeah.
I think this trip likely deepened his understanding of its importance.
Okay.
You know, he saw firsthand how self-interest and power struggles were tearing society apart.
Right.
And he believed that cultivating this deep sense of humanity
Okay.
was the key to restoring harmony.
Okay.
It wasn't just about following rituals.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it was about transforming individuals
Yeah.
from the inside out.
It sounds like he was advocating for a more ethical approach to leadership and social interaction.
In contrast to the self-serving behaviors he was witnessing.
Exactly.
Did this make him more traditional in his outlook? Like wanting to return to a more idealized past?
That's a good question.
Or did it push him in new directions?
That's a question that scholars have debated for centuries.
Yeah.
Some argue that this trip made him more determined to restore the traditional values and rituals of the past.
Okay.
You know, he saw firsthand the chaos that resulted when those values were neglected.
Right.
But others suggest that this experience also exposed him to new ideas and ways of thinking.
Okay.
Prompting him to adapt.
Okay.
And evolve his approach.
So maybe a bit of both.
Yeah, I think so.
A deep respect for tradition,
Right.
but also a willingness to adapt to changing circumstances. Like that saying that the only constant is change.
Right.
But did he just observe these political dynamics from afar?
Well, or did he actually engage with them in Luoyang? Like, did he have any direct experience with the rituals and ceremonies of the Zhou court?
We know from historical accounts that he did visit the Zhou royal court,
Right.
and observe these rituals firsthand.
Yeah.
This must have been an incredible experience for someone who was deeply interested in the traditions and proper conduct of society.
Right.
He wasn't just a passive observer.
Yeah.
He was actively engaging with the cultural and political landscape.
This brings us to another important concept in Confucianism.
Yeah.
This idea of Li, ritual propriety.
Right.
Could you elaborate on how Li relates to Ren?
Sure.
And how this trip might have influenced Confucius's understanding of both concepts?
Yeah, so Li encompasses the rituals, the ceremonies, the social norms
Okay.
that provide structure and order to society.
Okay.
While Ren is the inner virtue,
Okay.
the moral compass.
Yes.
You know, Li
Yeah.
is the outward expression of that virtue. And Confucius believed that by performing rituals with sincerity and understanding, individuals could cultivate their inner Ren
Okay.
and contribute to a more harmonious society.
It's like Li provides the framework, the guidelines for ethical behavior, while Ren is the driving force, the motivation behind those actions.
Exactly.
So he wasn't just advocating like blind adherence to tradition.
Right.
He was emphasizing the importance of aligning outward actions with inner virtue.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And his experiences in Luoyang, observing the rituals of the court while also witnessing the political fragmentation
All right.
and moral decay.
Yeah.
Likely deepened his understanding of this complex relationship between Li and Ren.
Right.
He saw that rituals alone were not enough. They needed to be grounded in genuine morality.
Okay.
And a commitment to justice.
This journey to Luoyang really seems to have been like a turning point for Confucius.
Yeah, it really was.
He's gone from being a local teacher and clerk to someone with a much wider perspective,
right.
a deeper understanding of the challenges facing his society.
Absolutely.
But he eventually returns to Lu, doesn't he?
He does.
Well, what happens next? Does he go back to his old life, or does he take this newfound knowledge and do something different?
He returns to Lu, but he's not the same man who left.
Right.
This trip has changed him. He's seen the bigger picture.
Right.
And he's got new ideas brewing.
It's like coming back from an amazing study abroad program.
Right.
You've got all this new knowledge, and you're ready to make your mark on the world.
Yeah, exactly.
How does this shift in perspective manifest in his teaching?
That's where we'll pick up next time.
Okay.
Join us as we continue our deep dive into the life of Confucius and explore how his journey continues to unfold.
All right.
We'll see how he applies his newfound wisdom, the challenges he faces, and the lasting legacy he creates.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the early life of Confucius. We left off with him returning to Lu, transformed by his experiences in Luoyang. He's seen the bigger picture now, grappling with the complexities of his time and carrying new insights about the relationship between ritual and virtue.
Yes, this journey has profoundly impacted how Confucius approaches education and his role in society. He returns to teaching, but with a renewed sense of purpose.
So it's not just back to business as usual. What's different about his teaching now? Does he have like a new curriculum, or is it more about like a shift in emphasis?
It's both. He still teaches those practical skills, reading, writing, accounting, but there's a greater emphasis on moral development.
Okay.
This is where his concept of Ren, translated as benevolence or humanity, really takes center stage.
This wasn't just like some abstract philosophical concept, was it? How did he actually teach Ren? Did he have like a 10 steps to benevolence program?
He wasn't about giving, easy answers or step-by-step instructions.
Right.
Instead, he encouraged his students to cultivate Ren through self-reflection, studying ancient texts, observing virtuous role models, and engaging in ethical conduct in their daily lives.
Okay.
It was about integrating this ideal into every aspect of their being.
So he was emphasizing a holistic approach to education, nurturing both the mind and the heart. And it wasn't just about personal growth, was it? He saw this as essential for creating a better society.
That's the key point. Confucius believed that a harmonious and just society could only be achieved if individuals cultivated their inner virtue. He saw Ren as the foundation for strong relationships, ethical leadership, and social harmony.
Yeah.
It was the antidote to the self-interest and power struggles that were tearing society apart.
Yeah, it's a powerful idea that resonates even today.
Yeah.
But promoting such a radical concept in those turbulent times couldn't have been easy. Did he face any pushback?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Not everyone embraced his ideas.
Right.
Some saw his emphasis on virtue and ethics as a threat to the established order.
Right.
They were comfortable with the status quo, even if it was riddled with injustice and inequality.
Yeah, it makes you think about the challenges anyone faces when they try to bring about change, especially when it involves questioning deeply ingrained social norms and power structures.
Right.
But Confucius didn't give up, did he?
Not at all. He continued to teach, attract new students, and refine his ideas. He was a master communicator, using stories, metaphors, witty sayings to make his points memorable and accessible.
Right.
This is part of what made his teaching so enduring.
It's fascinating that even though he didn't write any books himself, his ideas were preserved and passed down through generations. It speaks to the power of his message and the dedication of his followers.
Absolutely. That's right. It was his students who compiled his sayings and conversations into what we now know as the Analects, a collection that has had an immeasurable impact on Chinese thought and culture for over 2 millennia.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the early life of Confucius,
Yeah.
what are the key takeaways? Why should we care about this guy who lived thousands of years ago?
Well, Confucius's story reminds us that even amidst chaos and uncertainty, individuals have the power to make a difference.
Hmm.
His emphasis on education, ethical leadership, and the cultivation of inner virtue continues to inspire people around the world.
Right.
His teachings are a testament to the power of ideas to shape history
Yeah.
and offer timeless wisdom for navigating the complexities of human existence.
It's been an incredible journey exploring his early years, seeing how his experiences shaped his philosophy and understanding why his message continues to resonate today.
Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. This time, we're going way back to 5th century BC China
Oh, wow.
to explore the life and choices of the legendary Confucius.
Okay.
Specifically, we'll be examining his decision to leave the state of Lu and travel to Qi on this period of Confucius's life.
It's a period that's often misunderstood.
Yeah,
People tend to think of Confucius as a purely academic figure,
right.
removed from the political realities of his time.
And our deep dive today will unpack just how intertwined his life was with the politics of the era.
Yeah.
We'll look at the historical context, his personal motivations, and maybe even debunk a myth or two along the way.
One of the most common misconceptions is that Confucius fled Lu out of fear during a period of political turmoil.
Really?
But as our source points out, the situation was much more nuanced than that.
Okay, so let's set the scene for our listeners.
Sure.
What was going on in the state of Lu at the time?
The state was essentially ruled by the Duke of Lu, but he was constantly challenged by three powerful noble families,
Okay,
known as the three Huan families.
I see.
Think of them as powerful clans vying for control, almost like a Game of Thrones playing out within the state.
So there was already tension and power struggles before things escalated.
Absolutely, and this tension came to a head when the Duke of Lu was exiled by the three Huan families.
Wow.
This threw the state into a brief period of civil war, but it ended quickly with the three Huan families consolidating their power.
So this is where Confucius comes in.
Right.
He was working for one of the three Huan families, right?
Yes, he was employed as a tutor and advisor,
Okay.
which, as you can imagine, put him in a very complicated position.
Because on the one hand, he's working for the very people who overthrew the Duke, but he also believes strongly in loyalty to the ruler.
Exactly.
So talk about a rock and a hard place.
Exactly. He could have easily stayed in Lu, continued to benefit from his position, and thrived under the new power structure.
But instead, he chose to follow the exiled Duke to the state of Qi.
He did.
Was this just a rash decision driven by idealism, or was there more to it?
Our source argues that it was a calculated move,
Hmm.
a strategic gamble on his part.
What makes you say that?
Well, first, think about the timing. The civil war in Lu was extremely brief.
Okay.
By the time Confucius left, things had stabilized under the three Huan families. He wasn't fleeing imminent danger.
So it wasn't so much about escaping a bad situation, but maybe about seizing a potential Okay.
Confucius was betting on the possibility of the Duke eventually returning to power.
And if that were to happen, he'd be in a prime position to benefit.
Exactly.
But wouldn't that have been a huge gamble? I mean, what were the chances of the Duke actually regaining control?
It was definitely a risk, no doubt, but the source draws a fascinating parallel with a similar situation in the state of Wei,
Uh-huh.
where officials who remained loyal to their exiled duke were rewarded with prominent positions upon his return.
So Confucius may have seen this as a historical precedent,
Yeah.
a reason to believe that his gamble could pay off. But how does this all fit into his personal philosophy and beliefs?
Right.
He was known for emphasizing loyalty, right?
Absolutely, and siding with the three Fawn families would have directly contradicted his core values. By choosing to follow the Duke even into exile, he demonstrated his unwavering commitment to the principle of loyalty to the rightful ruler.
Okay, so we're starting to see a picture of Confucius as not just a scholar and teacher, but also a shrewd political player willing to take risks to advance both his career and his ideals. Is that a fair assessment?
I think so, and it's important to remember that this was a time when ambition and personal connections played a huge role in political life.
Yeah.
Confucius was no exception.
And speaking of personal connections, before we dive deeper into his motives.
It's a fascinating parallel to the grand tour that European nobles undertook centuries later.
So kind of like study abroad meets networking extravaganza for the ancient elite. Tell me more.
Well, these journeys were seen as essential for young nobles to broaden their horizons, experience different cultures, and most importantly, build relationships with influential figures from other states.
And Confucius participated in one of these study tours early in his life?
He did.
Where did he go and who did he meet?
Our source mentions a trip he took with a young noble named Nanggong Jingshu to Luoyang, the capital of the Zhou dynasty.
Okay.
Officially, the purpose was to report a death and seek a royal commendation.
Right.
But of course, it was also a prime opportunity for networking.
It's like LinkedIn for the ancient world, except instead of endorsing skills, they were exchanging political favors and philosophical ideas.
Ah, I like that analogy, and it's on this trip that Confucius allegedly encountered a figure named Lao Dan.
Wait, Lao Dan, as in Laozi, the legendary author of the Tao Te Ching?
Ah, yes. Now, this is where we get into the myth-busting territory. For centuries, there's been this misconception that the Lao Dan Confucius met was actually Laozi himself.
Okay, I can see how that story would get passed down and embellished.
It meticulously debunks this myth.
Okay.
First, the timelines don't align. And more importantly, Confucius never mentions the Tao Te Ching or its author in any of his own writings.
Right.
Which seems highly unlikely if they had actually met.
So if it wasn't true, why did this story become so widespread?
It seems that later schools of thought, possibly rivals of Confucianism, were trying to discredit Confucius.
Oh, wow.
By inventing this tale of him being schooled by Laozi.
Wow, so even back then there were attempts to rewrite history for political purposes.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that history is often told from a particular perspective, and it's always important to question the motives of those who are shaping the narrative.
Okay, that's fascinating. But let's get back to Confucius's big decision to leave Luffy. You mentioned that it wasn't just about loyalty to the Duke. Was there a personal element at play as well?
Right.
Maybe a rivalry or a grudge?
Yes, actually there was. Our source introduces us to a figure named Yang Hu, a rival of Confucius who had previously humiliated him.
Ooh, this is getting juicy. Tell me more about this Yang Hu and how he factors into the story.
Well, Yang Hu represents the opposite path that Confucius could have taken. He chose to side with the powerful three Huan families, demonstrating that ambition and pragmatism often won out over loyalty and idealism in these power struggles.
So you have Confucius driven by principle and a long-term vision, and Yang Hu seizing the immediate opportunity for power. What a fascinating contract.
And this rivalry adds a personal dimension to Confucius's decision.
Yeah.
It suggests that his choice wasn't solely based on abstract principles, but also on a very human desire to prove himself and perhaps even get one over on his old rival.
Okay, this is already giving us a much more nuanced and complex picture of Confucius than we usually get. So he's in Lu facing this dilemma taught between his ideals and his ambition. What ultimately tipped the scales in favor of following the exiled Duke to Qi?
That's a great question. It delves into the potential rewards. Confucius might have envisioned his understanding of loyalty in the context of political upheaval and how his actions reflect his broader philosophy.
Okay, now I'm really intrigued. Tell me more about these potential rewards and how Confucius might have viewed them.
Well, that's a perfect segue into the next part of our deep dive.
Okay.
We'll need to pick up this thread and unpack those motivations in more detail.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the life of Confucius. Last time we left off with Confucius facing a big decision, stay in the state of Lua under the new rulers, or follow the exiled Duke to the state of Qi. It was a gamble.
It was.
Fueled by loyalty, ambition, and maybe even a bit of rivalry. But you were saying there were potential rewards he might have had his eye on.
That's right. It's easy to view this decision through a modern lens, but to really understand Confucius's motivations,
Yeah.
we need to consider the political realities of his time.
So help me understand the political landscape a bit better. What kind of rewards could someone in Confucius's position realistically hope to gain by following an exiled duke?
Well, think about it. In ancient China, power was often fluid and cyclical.
Okay.
Dukes were exiled and restored all the time, so if the exiled Duke of Lu were to regain his throne, those who had remained loyal to him would be in a very advantageous position.
They'd be seen as the true loyalists.
Yeah.
And potentially rewarded with prominent positions in the government. But wasn't that a huge if?
Oh, it was.
How could Confucius be so sure that the Duke would ever return to power?
Of course, there were no guarantees. There's a case in the state of Wei where officials who followed their exiled Duke were given key government roles when he eventually returned to power.
So Confucius might have seen that as a precedent.
Yeah.
A reason to believe that his gamble could actually pay off.
Exactly. And beyond the potential for political advancement, there's another layer to Confucius's motivations that we need to consider: his personal philosophy and beliefs.
Right. He was deeply committed to the idea of loyalty to the ruler, even if that ruler wasn't currently in power. Choosing to stay in Lu and serve the three Huan families would have been a betrayal of those principles.
Precisely, Confucius believed that a just and harmonious society depended on a clear hierarchy, with the ruler at the top. To him, following the exiled duke was about upholding that order,
Right.
even in the face of adversity.
So it wasn't just about personal gain, it was about taking a stand for what he believed in.
Absolutely. And this brings us to another fascinating
I
point.
mentioned earlier that he had this rivalry with Yang Hu, who chose to side with the three Huan families.
Right.
How did that rivalry factor into things?
Well, imagine yourself in Confucius's position. You have this rival who's chosen the seemingly pragmatic path,
Yeah.
the one that's likely to bring immediate rewards. Wouldn't you feel a certain drive to prove that your path,
Mm-hmm.
the path of principle and loyalty, could ultimately lead to greater success?
I could see how that competitive spirit might have pushed him to take a bigger risk. To show that his way was the right way.
Exactly, and it adds another layer of complexity to understanding of Confucius.
Yeah.
He wasn't just a detached philosopher spouting lofty ideals. He was a human being with ambitions, rivalries, and a desire to make his mark on the world.
It's a reminder that even the most influential figures in history were driven by a mix of personal and philosophical motives.
Precisely, and I think that's what makes studying history so compelling. It's not just about memorizing dates and names. It's about understanding the motivations and complexities of the people who shaped the course of events.
Okay, so we've established that Confucius's decision to follow the Duke was driven by a combination of loyalty, ambition, and perhaps a dash of rivalry. But he wasn't just a lone scholar making this journey, was he? He had a family to consider.
That's an excellent. Confucius likely took his wife and children with him to Qi. He seems to have been quite eager to find employment upon arriving, suggesting the practical realities of needing to provide for his family.
It humanizes him, doesn't it? It shows that even while pursuing these grand political and philosophical goals, he was still grounded in the everyday concerns of a husband and father.
Absolutely. It's those glimpses into his personal life that make him relatable across millennia.
So he arrives in Qi with his family, hoping to find a position that will allow him to both support them and potentially advance his political career. What happens next? What kind of reception did he receive?
Well, before we get into his experiences in Qi,
Yeah?
there's one more interesting detail from his time in Lu that our source highlights. It involves that study tour we discussed earlier, the one to Luoyang.
Oh, right, the ancient LinkedIn trip where he supposedly met Lao Dan, who was definitely not lousy. What else did our source reveal about that journey?
Well, it points out that this trip wasn't just a random occurrence.
Okay.
It was actually part of a larger pattern in Confucius's life.
What do you mean?
Throughout his early career, Confucius was constantly seeking out opportunities to connect with influential figures and gain recognition for his knowledge and abilities.
Okay.
The study tour to Luoyang was just one example of this.
So he was already networking and building relationships long before he faced the decision of whether to follow the Duke.
Exactly, and this pattern continues in Qi.
Okay.
Our source emphasizes that Confucius was very strategic in cultivating connections with powerful people, attending social gatherings, and showcasing his expertise on ritual and governance.
It sounds like he was playing the long game, not just relying on his loyalty to the Duke to guarantee him a position. He was actively working to make himself indispensable.
That's a great way to put it. He was creating opportunities for himself,
Yeah.
building a reputation that extended beyond his connection to the exiled Duke.
Okay, so we're seeing a portrait of Confucius as a savvy networker, a skilled politician, and a man deeply committed to his ideals. But we still haven't talked about how his gamble actually played out. Did he find success in Qi? Did the Duke ever return to power?
Well, that's where things get even more intriguing. And unfortunately, that's where we'll have to leave our listeners hanging for now. Stay tuned for the final part of our deep dive, where we'll explore Confucius's experiences in Qi and whether his calculated risk ultimately paid off.
All right, listeners, you heard it here. We're about to uncover the next chapter in Confucius's life and find out if his gamble led to triumph or disappointment. Don't miss the thrilling conclusion to our deep dive. And following his journey from the state of Lu, where he faced a difficult choice, stay or follow the exiled Duke to the state of Qi. It was a gamble, fueled by loyalty, ambition, and maybe even a bit of rivalry.
Yeah, it really was.
But did it pay off?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And the answer, as with most things in history, is complicated.
Okay.
Confucius's time in Qi was marked by both successes and setbacks.
Okay, I'm on the edge of my seat. Give me the highlights. Did he land a plum government position? Did he become the Duke's right-hand man?
Not quite. While he did manage to secure a position in the Qi court, it wasn't a particularly high-ranking one.
Oh.
He served as an advisor on ritual and governance.
Okay.
But he wasn't exactly shaping policy or wielding major influence.
So not the meteoric rise to power he might have been hoping for?
No, but it wasn't a complete failure either. Remember, Confucius was a master networker. He used his time in Qi to cultivate relationships with influential people, attend social gatherings, and showcase his knowledge.
So he was still playing the long game, even if the immediate rewards weren't as great as he might have imagined.
Exactly, and this is where our source offers a really insightful perspective.
Okay.
It suggests that Confucius's experiences in Xi, both the successes and the setbacks, played a crucial role in shaping his later thinking and teachings.
That's interesting. How so?
Well, think about it. He went to Qi with this idealistic vision of restoring the duke to power and ushering in an era of good governance, but the reality of court politics was much messier and more complex than he perhaps anticipated.
So he saw firsthand that personal ambition, factionalism, and power struggles could often undermine even the most well-intentioned efforts at reform.
Exactly, and this experience seems to have tempered his idealism,
Yeah.
leading him to develop a more pragmatic and nuanced approach to politics and governance.
So the Confucius who eventually returned to Lu was not the same wide-eyed idealist who had left years earlier.
Precisely. He had been tested by the realities of power and emerged with a deeper understanding of the challenges and compromises involved in governing a state.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like he went through a political boot camp, and it shaped his thinking in profound ways.
That's a great analogy, and this transformation is evident in his later teachings, which emphasize the importance of not just moral principles, but also practical skills, adaptability, and the ability to navigate complex social and political dynamics.
It's like he learned that being a good ruler, or even a good advisor, wasn't just about having the right ideas,
Right.
but also about knowing how to put those ideas into practice in a messy, imperfect world.
Exactly. And this, I think, is one of the most important takeaways from our deep dive today.
Yeah.
We often view Confucius as this timeless sage dispensing wisdom from on high.
Right.
But he was also a product of his time, shaped by his experiences and constantly evolving in his thinking.
He was a real person facing real challenges and learning from his mistakes.
Absolutely. And that, I think, makes his teachings all the more relevant and relatable to us today.
Yeah.
We all face challenges and setbacks in our lives.
Mm-hmm.
The key is to learn from them, adapt, and keep striving to become better versions of ourselves.
So what happened to Confucius after his time in Qi?
Well,
Did he eventually return to Lu? Did his gamble ever pay off?
he did eventually return to Lu, but the Book never remapped power. However, Confucius's experiences in Qi had made him a more mature and seasoned thinker,
Okay.
and he went on to have a profound impact on Chinese thought and culture.
So even though his initial gamble didn't pay off in the way he might have hoped, it ultimately set him on a path to becoming one of the most influential figures in history.
That's the beauty of history, isn't it? Sometimes the choices that seem like failures in the moment end up leading us to unexpected and even greater successes.
It's a reminder that life is full of twists and turns, and that even the most carefully laid plans can be upended by unforeseen circumstances. But what matters most is how we learn from our experiences, adapt to change, and continue to pursue our goals with resilience and wisdom.
Well said. And who knows, maybe this deep dive into Confucius's life has inspired some of our listeners to reflect on their own choices, their own ambitions, and their own understanding of loyalty and principle.
To all our deep divers out there, thanks for joining us on this journey through history. We hope it's sparked your curiosity and given you some food for thought. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep. All right, so everyone knows Confucius, right? The wise sage, all those quotes.
Yeah, exactly.
But what about the stuff that, made him who he was, the experiences?
Yeah.
Today, we're going to go back in time and uncover Confucius in exile.
That's right. It's easy to think of Confucius as this timeless figure,
Right.
kind of removed from like messy politics,
Yeah.
But he was right in the thick of it.
Yeah.
Power struggles of his time, and that really impacted his philosophy.
So we're talking China's spring and autumn period. Rivalry between states.
Yeah.
Powerful families are vying for control, and right there in the middle of it all,
Yep.
Confucius serving Duke Zhao of Lu, but then things get dramatic. The Duke is forced into exile by the three Huan families.
Right, these powerful nobles who essentially like controlled the state.
Right.
Now, you got to understand, in this period, exile, it wasn't just like, oh, a personal setback.
Right.
It had huge political implications.
Hmm.
Other codes were expected to offer refuge to exiled rulers and even help them get back in power.
Wow.
It was all about keeping like this balance of power, upholding certain codes of conduct.
So it's a high-stakes game.
Oh, absolutely.
So what does Confucius do?
Well, he decides to follow Duke Zhao into exile,
Wow.
which was, could make or break his career.
Big risk.
Yeah, it's a calculated risk. I
Yeah.
mean, on the one hand, shows loyalty to the Duke, right?
Yeah.
Could lead to big rewards if he regains the throne.
Like, think about the influence Confucius could have.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But then on the other hand, there's tons of uncertainty.
Yeah.
He's relying on another state, the state of Qi.
Right.
And, who knows how things will turn out for Duke Zhao.
Yeah. So what stands out to you about Confucius's decision?
I think it reveals a lot about his character, you know?
Yeah.
He's clearly not just like a passive scholar.
Right.
This guy is willing to take risks, get into the political arena. He believes in Duke Xiao, and maybe he sees this as a chance to like put his ideas into practice, you know?
About good governance.
Exactly, yeah.
So they end up in the court of Duke Jing of Qi,
Right.
who seems to welcome them. But is it smooth sailing from here?
No.
Okay.
Not really. Duke Xiao is taken care of.
Okay.
But efforts to restore him face big roadblocks. There's internal problems in the ruling Zhou dynasty, and the state of Jin, kind of the overlord of all these smaller states,
Right.
is dealing with its own power struggles.
So bad timing all around.
Yeah, pretty much.
How does this affect Confucius?
Well, imagine you arrive in a foreign court, right?
Yeah.
Full of its own power dynamics.
Right.
Suspicion toward newcomers.
Oh, yeah.
Confucius, he's a scholar,
Yeah.
not a seasoned politician.
Right.
So he struggles. He can't get a good position in the Duke's court.
Oh, wow.
Ends up working for a powerful noble in Qi named Gao Xiao, possibly doing like clerical work or continuing to teach.
It's just so interesting how he adapts.
Yeah.
From advisor to a duke to working for a noble.
Right.
In a whole other state.
Totally different.
Talk about resilience.
Totally.
But then something really interesting happens. He has this encounter with Duke Jing of Qi,
Yes.
the ruler who is hosting this entire exile court.
Yeah, this is a pivotal moment.
Okay?
Duke Jing had heard about Confucius, right? His reputation for wisdom.
Right.
And remember, Duke Xiao is right there,
Yeah.
exiled because he wasn't a good ruler.
Right.
So when Duke Jing asks Confucius, what's it take to be successful in governing?
Oh, wow.
It's a loaded question.
I can only imagine the pressure.
Right.
So how does Confucius respond?
He says, let the ruler be a ruler, the subject be a subject, the father be a father, and the son be a son.
Now, that might sound, obvious to us, but how would that have been perceived back then?
Well, actually, it was pretty radical. Yeah, this was a time of like shifting power dynamics.
Right.
Nobles are challenging rulers.
Yeah.
Sons are trying to get their dad's positions.
Wow.
Confucius is advocating for a clear social order
Okay.
where everyone understands their role
Right.
and their responsibilities.
He's saying stick to your roles, maintain harmony.
Exactly.
And Duke Jing seems to get it.
He does.
He even remarks that, if the social order breaks down, everybody suffers, even him.
Yeah.
It's a very practical way of looking at things.
Pragmatic, yeah.
And some accounts even suggest that Duke Jing was so impressed by Confucius that he considered offering him a fief,
Yeah, that's right.
making him like a high-ranking noble in Du.
Right.
So, historians debate this, but it adds intrigue to the story.
Definitely does, yeah.
From exile to nobility.
Right.
All thanks to one insightful answer.
Exactly.
But ultimately, things don't work out that way for Confucius.
Yeah, they don't.
Years pass. Hope of Duke Xiao's return starts to dwindle.
Yeah.
Then we have the intervention of Fan Shanzi,
Right.
a powerful noble from the state of Jin.
Yep.
He tries to make peace between Duke Xiao and the three Huan.
Yeah.
Sounds promising?
It does.
Could this be like the breakthrough?
You'd think so, right?
Yeah.
Unfortunately, no.
Okay.
Fan Shanzi had his own agenda.
Oh, okay.
He's more interested in getting power for himself in Jin than genuinely helping Duke Xiao.
Oh, wow.
So he tries to persuade Duke Xiao to return to Lu and just, basically accept that the three Huan are in control.
That's not really a solution.
No.
Of course, Duke Xiao refuses.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the intervention fails,
Yeah.
which highlights the declining power of the state of Jin.
Right.
And, just the bleak prospects for Duke Xiao and in turn, Confucius.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's a pretty low point.
it is.
So what happens next?
Tragically, 2 years after that, Duke Xiao dies.
Oh, that's so sad.
Yeah,
All those years wanting to go home.
I know.
It ends like that.
It does.
So his court disbands. The three Huan choose a different brother, a more,
Pliable.
pliable brother to become the new duke.
Right.
And they consolidate their power in Lu.
Exactly.
But here's another twist.
Yeah.
Historical accounts suggest that Confucius went back to Lu before Duke Xiao died.
That's right, yeah.
Really?
Yeah,
He leaves before it's over.
he does.
Why would he do that?
Good question. It's not entirely clear from the sources, but maybe he saw the writing on the wall,
Yeah.
The intervention failed. Duke Xiao was getting older.
Right.
No clear path to getting him back.
Right.
And Confucius was 42 by this point.
Mm.
And he famously said, at 40, I had no doubts.
Right.
Maybe those years in exile, seeing the failures of political maneuvering, brought him to that point,
Yeah, like clarity.
Yeah, like clarity.
Disillusioned, but with a new sense of purpose.
Perhaps.
Heads back home.
Yep.
What awaits him in Luoyang?
Right.
And how did this experience shape him?
Yeah.
We'll have to unpack that in part 2.
It's fascinating to think about how this exile, which seems like a major setback, might have actually been like a turning point,
Yeah.
in Confucius's intellectual development.
Yeah.
It's like these experiences, these failures and frustration pushed him to, like, go deeper into his ideas about the world.
That's a really interesting way to look at it.
Yeah.
So you're saying these difficult years actually helped shape his philosophy?
I think it's very likely. Yeah, he went into exile with certain, expectations, maybe even, like, political ambitions. He was betting on Duke Xiao,
Right.
hoping to, like, rise with him and influence change.
But instead, he's hit with these, harsh realities of power struggles,
Right.
fragility of alliances, limits of his own influence. It's like a crash course in political disillusionment.
Exactly. And that forces him to, like, reevaluate
Yeah.
his assumptions about how the world works.
Right.
About power.
Right.
About, the role of a scholar in society.
So this makes me wonder if it was during this time that he really starts to, like, solidify those ideas about ethical leadership, the importance of virtue,
Right.
moral principles in governing.
Yeah, it's a compelling theater.
Right.
After all, when he gets back to Lu, he doesn't, just jump back into politics.
Right.
Instead, he focuses on, like, teaching, developing his philosophical ideas.
Right.
It's like he shifts his focus from trying to change the world through politics to shaping the minds of future leaders, hoping they'll, like, embody those principles.
So even though he's had this political setback, he's not giving up on his ideals.
No, not at all.
He's finding a different way to make a difference.
Exactly, yeah.
And this brings us to another one of his sayings that might be connected to this experience.
Okay.
A gentleman is dignified, but not contemptuous, sociable, but not cliquish.
Yeah, I love that quote.
Such a relevant quote even today.
It is.
How do you connect it back to his time in exile?
Well, in exile, Confucius tried to align himself with a political faction,
Yeah.
Duke Zhao's supporters.
Right.
Didn't work out well.
Right.
In fact, it backfired.
Right.
And I think this experience may have made him realize the dangers of getting too caught up in, factionalism, political maneuvering.
It's like he learned that true leadership isn't about clinging to power,
Right.
or forming these, exclusive groups.
Yeah.
It's about rising above those petty squabbles,
Right.
and focusing on what's really important.
Exactly.
Principles,
Yeah.
integrity,
Right.
the well-being of society.
Exactly. And there's a great anecdote that shows this.
Oh, okay.
It's in the Analects.
Right.
So Confucius is back in Lu, right?
Yeah.
And he gets criticized for defending Duke Zhao.
Okay.
Even though the Duke's, no longer in power.
Right.
And somebody says to him, didn't you say a gentleman doesn't form cliques? Why are you still defending your old political buddy?
Ouch. That's got to sting.
I know.
Especially after everything he's been through.
Right.
And it shows it, like, his actions were being watched.
Right.
That this association with Duke Xiao had a lasting impact.
It really did. And it highlights the social consequences of political affiliations, Yeah. Even though he's back in Lu, he's not exactly, welcomed back with open arms.
Right.
He's still dealing with the ripple effects of his exile.
It makes you think about the lasting impact of the choices we make.
Absolutely.
Especially in a society where those social connections are so important.
Yeah.
Right.
And remember those two prominent disciples we talked about?
Yes.
Men Yizhi and Nanggao Jingshu?
Yeah.
The ones that aren't on that traditional list of 72 disciples?
Right. It seems strange they'd be omitted, especially, since they were so close to Confucius.
That is strange. And some scholars actually think this is directly related to their ties to the three Huan families.
Right. Those powerful nobles who opposed Duke Zhao.
Exactly. Yeah.
So even years later, those political divisions from his exile are shaping relationships,
right,
influencing who's in and who's out.
Exactly.
It just shows how deep those political fault lines ran.
They really did.
And that they continued to have an impact.
Yeah.
Even long after.
Yeah, and it also reminds us that Confucius wasn't just like this wise sage,
right,
dispensing timeless wisdom.
Yeah.
He was a real person,
right,
navigating these complex political realities, dealing with the consequences of his choices, even experiencing social ostracism,
It makes him so much more, like, human.
Right.
And relatable.
Exactly.
We all face these situations where we have to make tough choices. And sometimes those choices come back.
They do, yeah.
To haunt us.
Yeah.
It's interesting, though, that even though he's back in Lu, it doesn't seem like he's achieved that influence that maybe he envisioned.
No, not really.
So what happens next?
Well, this is where things get interesting again.
Okay.
Confucius decides to leave Lu again.
Okay.
But this time, it's not exile.
Okay.
It's a different kind of journey.
Okay.
He embarks on what we now call his travels among the states.
Okay, now I'm really intrigued.
Yeah.
Tell me more about these travels.
Okay, well, he spends years traveling throughout China,
Hmm.
visiting different courts, offering advice to rulers, getting into philosophical debates.
Mm-hmm.
It's like he's taking his ideas on the road,
Right.
seeking out, those who might be open to his message.
So he's almost like a wandering philosopher,
Yeah, in a way.
sharing wisdom, seeking out like-minded people.
Exactly.
But why does he leave again? What's pushing him?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
And it's something we'll explore in part 3.
Okay.
But I think it's safe to say his experiences in exile, the
Yeah.
setbacks and the things he learned, they played a major role
Right.
in shaping this next chapter
Yeah.
of his life.
So he's back in Lucia after all those years in exile, but he doesn't stay for long.
Right.
Instead, heads out on these travels, among the states.
Yeah.
Seems like, I don't know, kind of a bold move after everything he's been through.
Yeah.
Why leave what's familiar, especially when he's not exactly being welcomed back?
I think that's a key question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it says a lot about Confucius,
Mm-hmm.
his character, his commitment to his ideals. Think about it,
Yeah.
He's experienced political disillusionment,
Yeah.
social ostracism,
Yeah.
loss of his patron, but he doesn't, become cynical or reclusive. He
Okay.
keeps going, keeps engaging with the world, keeps looking for those opportunities to make a difference.
Makes me think of those inspiring figures,
Yeah.
who face these setbacks but never give up.
Right.
They just find a way to adapt, to find new avenues
Yeah.
for their passions. So what was he hoping to achieve through these travels?
Hmm.
Was it still about political influence, or was it something more?
Well, that's where it looks really interesting.
Okay.
These travels weren't about power or revenge.
Right.
This was about something much bigger.
Okay.
Refining and spreading his ideas about good governance, ethical leadership,
Right.
the importance of education. Imagine him traveling to all these different courts,
Yeah.
debating, challenging rulers, inspiring thinkers.
So almost like he's on a mission
Yeah,
to plant these seeds for a better society,
exactly.
hoping they'll take root
Yeah.
in different parts of China.
Yeah, and it's during these travels that, those famous Confucian concepts we've heard of,
Right.
like Ren and Le,
Right.
they really start to take shape.
Okay, so let's break those down a bit.
Sure.
We've all heard those terms, but what do they really mean?
Yeah.
In the context of his philosophy.
Right. So Ren is often translated as like benevolence,
Okay.
humanness. It's about cultivating compassion, empathy,
Right.
a sense of duty towards others.
Oh, okay.
It's not just about being a good ruler. It's about being a good person.
Right.
Recognizing that, every human being has worth and dignity.
So ethical leadership begins with personal virtue.
Exactly.
You can't lead others effectively unless you've got those qualities in yourself.
Exactly. And then there's Le,
Yeah.
often translated as like rituals or rites.
Right.
But it's not just about empty formalities
Right.
or just like following rules blindly.
Yeah.
It's about understanding the importance of social norms
Hmm.
and how they contribute to like, harmony and order.
Right.
It's about behaving appropriately in different situations, respecting hierarchies, understanding the interconnectedness of society.
And it's interesting to think how these ideas might have been shaped, by that exile experience.
Yeah.
He saw what happens when those social structures break down.
Yeah.
When people just abandon those principles
Right.
of respect and duty.
And his travels, they allowed him to kind of refine those ideas through real-world observation, dialogue. He wasn't just like theorizing in isolation.
Right.
He was engaging
Yeah.
with different societies and seeing how those principles played out.
It's just amazing to think that even though he never held a high political office again,
Yeah.
he had this profound impact
He really did.
on Chinese thought and culture.
Right.
So how did these travels, contribute to that legacy?
Well, I think those years on the road, they were crucial. They allowed him to test and refine his ideas,
Right.
build up this network of disciples,
Yeah.
and spread his teachings
Right.
far and wide. And his ideas, they resonated
Yeah.
with people from all walks of life, and they got passed down through generations.
So even though he wasn't like ruling a state,
Right.
he was shaping the minds and hearts of all these people
Right.
who would then go on to influence their own community.
Exactly, yeah.
And that influence just ripples through history.
It does.
Confucianism, it became like a cornerstone of Chinese culture, influencing everything.
Pretty much, yeah.
It's incredible to think about how this one person who went through so much,
Yeah, right.
could have such an impact.
Yeah.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are some key takeaways? What do you hope our listeners will think about?
I think there are a few things.
Yeah.
First, Confucius's story, it reminds us that resilience and perseverance, they're so important.
Yeah.
Especially when, you're pursuing something bigger than yourself.
Right.
He faced so many challenges, but he never abandoned his ideals.
Right.
He found new ways to express them, to make a difference.
It's It's like that saying, what doesn't kill you
It makes you stronger.
makes you stronger. Yeah.
Yeah.
Exile, social ostracism. These could have broken him.
Yeah.
But instead, it fueled him.
Right.
And second.
Well, I think it shows the power of ideas.
Right.
He didn't achieve, like political dominance,
Hmm.
but his philosophy, it transformed a culture and continues to influence billions of people.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that sometimes the best kind of leadership, it's not about like wielding power. It's about, planting those seeds of thought that can grow and change.
Of the bottom up.
Yeah.
It's inspiring.
It is.
We face those setbacks, disappointments.
Right.
But we can choose how to respond.
Yeah.
We can get bitter and cynical.
Yeah.
Or we can learn, grow, and find new ways to have a positive impact.
Exactly. And finally, I think his story, it encourages us, to think about our own values, how we live them out in the world. What do we believe in? What are we willing to fight for?
Yeah.
How can we, like Confucius, use our own experiences to make things, more just and harmonious?
Those are some powerful questions to end on.
They are.
Thanks for joining me for this deep dive.
Absolutely. My pleasure.
Confucius's life, his legacy, it's a timeless source of wisdom for anyone really trying to live a life of purpose and meaning.
Yeah.
It's a journey worth exploring. I encourage everyone to keep digging into this fascinating chapter of history. Welcome back to the deep dive. Ready to go deep again.
Always. What about Confucius are we focusing on?
Specifically, his return to his home state of Lu.
Ah, after his years of exile. That's a pretty pivotal moment in his life, right?
Definitely. And we've got some really interesting sources about this period.
I'm all ears. What kind of sources are we talking about?
We've got some historical records and anecdotes that give us a glimpse into what was going on in Lu when Confucius returned and how he navigated the whole situation.
That sounds intriguing. So what's the mission of this deep dive? What are we hoping to uncover?
I think the big question here is, how did Confucius, who was a big advocate for tradition and proper conduct, deal with the fact that Lu had completely transformed in his absence?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's like coming home after a long trip and finding that everything you knew has been totally rearranged.
Exactly. So let's get into it. Paint us a picture. What was the situation in Lu when Confucius finally returned?
Well, during his exile, the balance of power had seriously shifted. We're talking big-time changes.
Okay, in what way?
You see, these families, the Huan, they were like these powerful oligarchs. During Confucius's exile, they had really consolidated their control over the state.
So they'd kind of taken over while he was away?
Basically. And this was a huge departure from the traditional power structure, the way things were supposed to be in Confucius's eyes.
Got it. And he was not a fan of this, right? I mean, he opposed these families before he left.
Oh, yeah, he definitely did, which makes his return even more interesting, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. So he comes back to Lu, and it's now ruled by the very people he disagreed with. Talk about awkward.
Right. It's like walking into a lion's den.
Totally. So what does he do? Does he challenge them? Does he protest?
Well, surprisingly, he doesn't go for an all-out confrontation. Confucius was a very subtle guy. Instead, he chose a more nuanced path.
Nuance. That's not usually the first word that comes to mind when you think of ancient power struggles.
It's true. But Confucius was a master of it. He found this delicate balance. Publicly, he acknowledged the Sun Quan's authority, but at the same time, he used all these subtle messages to signal how he really felt.
Wow, that sounds super tricky, like playing 4D chess or something. How did he pull that off?
Well, Confucius was a master of using history to make a point. He started highlighting the story of Boyi and Shuki to his students and everyone who would listen.
Boyi and Shuki. Remind me who they were again?
They were these two brothers, aristocrats from the Shang dynasty. They were known for their unwavering principles. When the Shang dynasty was overthrown by the Zhou, they flat out refused to eat Zhou grain.
Really? Why?
They saw the Zhou dynasty as illegitimate, so they basically saw eating their food as a betrayal of their principles. They actually chose to starve to death rather than compromise.
Wow, talk about taking a stand. But how does this relate to Confucius and the whole San Juan situation? Was he subtly suggesting a mass hunger strike?
Haha, no, not quite. Confucius focused on a particular aspect of their story, their lack of resentment. He really emphasized how they let go of the past, sought a peaceful resolution, even if it meant,
Yeah, even if it meant the ultimate sacrifice. So what was he getting at?
Well, it was a clever way to draw a parallel. He was basically saying, look, things change, regimes change, but we can't stay stuck in the past. We need to find a way to move forward peacefully.
I see. It's like he's subtly acknowledging the new reality while still holding on to his ideals.
Precisely. And the really interesting part is how he drew parallels between the Zhou overthrowing the Shang and the Sun Quan taking over Lu. He's not directly saying it, but the implication is there.
Right, like he's acknowledging the Sun Quan's rule without actually saying, hey, you guys were totally right.
Exactly. It's brilliant, really, and his messaging went even deeper than that.
Deeper. Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
Well, he also started drawing comparisons between Duke Zhao of Lu, the ruler who was essentially pushed out by the Sun Quan, and the tyrannical King Zhou of Shang.
Okay, wait, so who's Duke Xiao in all of this?
Duke Zhao was the ruler of Lu before the Senhan consolidated their power. He represented the old order, the way things were supposed to be according to Confucius.
Got it. So by comparing Duke Xiao to the tyrannical King Zhou, was Confucius kind of throwing shade at the Sanhan?
You could definitely see it that way. He was basically saying, hey, remember that terrible king everyone hated? Well, the guy you replaced was kind of like him, so maybe think about that.
Wow, that's some serious subtext. He's walking a very fine line here. So the Sanhan must have picked up on this, right?
We can only speculate on how they interpreted it, but it's clear Confucius was playing a very intricate game.
Yeah, he's not just going along with the new status quo. He's subtly pushing back, making his opinions known. But it wasn't just words, right? Didn't he also take some actions that showed his true allegiance?
You are absolutely correct. Confucius wasn't just all talk. He took some pretty significant actions, even years after Duke Xiao's death.
Okay, spill the tea. What did he do?
Well, for one, he made sure that Duke Xiao received all the proper burial rites.
Which was a big deal back then, right?
Huge deal. It was a way of showing respect, honoring the legacy of the deceased, and in a way, it was a subtle challenge to the San Juan's authority.
Right. It's like he's saying, I still recognize this guy as the legitimate ruler, even if you guys are in charge now.
Exactly. And that wasn't all. He made another decision that really showed where his loyalties lay.
I'm on the edge of my seat. Tell me.
A few years after Duke Xiao died, his wife passed away. Now, their marriage had been pretty controversial. There were a lot of rumors and wilders surrounding it.
Ooh, juicy. What kind of rumors?
Well, it was seen as a sign of Duke Xiao's weakness. People questioned his judgment, said he was easily manipulated. Attending her funeral was a risky move for Confucius, especially with the San Juan in power.
How so?
Well, remember, the San Juan benefited from Duke Xiao's downfall. By attending the funeral of his controversial wife, Confucius was potentially stirring up old resentments, reminding people of the Duke's perceived flaws.
And that could have made the San Juan very unhappy.
Exactly, but Confucius went anyway. He knew it was a risky move, but he did it anyway. It was a powerful statement.
Wow. So he's basically saying, I'm not afraid of you guys. I'm going to honor the memory of Duke Xiao and his family, even if you don't like it.
That's a great way to put it. It shows his incredible courage and his unwavering loyalty to his principles.
He's not backing down, even in the face of this new power structure. It's a really inspiring story, actually.
It is, and it speaks to a universal dilemma, doesn't it? How do you stay true to yourself when the world around you is changing, when the people in power might not share your values?
That's a great point. It's a question we all face in different ways, even today.
Absolutely, and Confucius's story shows that there's no easy answer. It's a constant balancing act.
Right. It's about finding a way to navigate a complex world without compromising your integrity.
Exactly, and that's where the story takes an even more fascinating turn, because now a new player enters the scene, Yang Hu.
Ah, Yang Hu. I've heard that name. He and Confucius didn't exactly see eye to eye.
Not at all, and his arrival really shakes things up in Lu.
Okay, I'm hooked. Tell me everything. Who is this Yang Hu and how does he fit into all of this? Yang Hu, this ambitious guy who basically took control of Lu, he invites Confucius to join his government.
It is a pretty dramatic turn of events, right?
Yeah, totally. You've got these two strong personalities representing completely opposite ideas about leadership and power. And now they're suddenly face to face.
It's like a clash of the titans.
Right, and it makes you wonder what was going through Confucius's mind. Here he is, carefully crafting this message, using history and tradition to navigate a really tricky situation, and then boom, he's hit with this direct challenge.
Join the system or risk making a powerful enemy. It's a tough spot to be in.
For sure. So what does he do? Does he see this as an opportunity to maybe influence things from the inside?
Well, his first reaction is anything but straightforward. He actually tries to avoid Yang Hu.
Avoid him, really?
Yeah, it's almost comical. He even goes to visit Yang Hu's house when he knows he's not home.
So he's not exactly jumping at the chance to work with this guy.
Not at all. It's like he's trying to politely decline the offer without actually saying no.
That's so Confucius. Always finding a way to express his opinion without directly challenging authority. But you can't avoid someone forever, right?
Nope. Fate, or maybe just Yang Hu's persistence, intervened. They end up bumping into each other, right there on the street. And Yang Hu doesn't miss a beat.
He seizes the moment.
Oh yeah, he makes his pitch, he appeals to Confucius's sense of duty, his desire to serve the state.
So he's playing the you can really make a difference card.
Exactly. He's like, look, you've got the wisdom, the experience, why not use it to help me govern?
It's a pretty persuasive argument, even if it's coming from someone whose methods Confucius really opposed.
It is, and it shows that Yang Hu recognized the value of having Confucius on his side, even if he didn't agree with all his traditionalist ideas.
It's like he knew that having Confucius on board would lend him a legitimacy that he couldn't get just from military victories?
Exactly. Yang Hu understood the power of symbolism.
Okay, so what does Confucius do? Does he give in?
This is where it gets even more interesting. He actually agrees. He gives Yang Hu his word, right there on the street, that he'll join the government.
He agrees. Wait, really? I thought he's trying to avoid this guy.
I know, right? It's a total surprise. But here's the catch, he never actually follows through.
Wait, he agrees and then does nothing. What's going on here?
It's a moment that has puzzled scholars for centuries. Some think it was a calculated move, like a way to appease Yang Hu without actually compromising his principles.
Sort of like, yeah, I'll get right on that. Just visit right now.
Exactly. Others see it as a sign of genuine internal conflict. Like maybe for a moment, Confucius really considered working with Yang Hu, but then ultimately decided against it.
So he's torn between his desire to serve his state and his belief that true leadership has to be based on virtue, not just power.
Yeah, it's a tough call, and it's a dilemma that we still face today, right? Do we compromise our ideas for a chance to make a difference? Or do we stick to our principles, even if it means missing an opportunity?
That's a big question, and Confucius's story doesn't really give us a clear-cut answer.
No, it doesn't, but it does show how complex these situations can be, and how difficult it is to navigate a world where power and morality don't always align.
Absolutely. And it raises another big question, too. How do we define success? Is it achieving concrete results, even if it means compromise? Or is it staying true to your values, even if it means not getting what you want?
Those are tough questions to grapple with, and I think Confucius's story reminds us that there's not always a simple answer.
So we've got Confucius navigating this new reality, dealing with the Sen Han families, and now we've got this whole Yang Hu saga. But didn't you say that Yang Hu's rule didn't last that long?
Ah, yes. That's right. Even the most cunning strategists can be undone by unforeseen circumstances.
So what happened? Did he finally get what was coming to him?
Well, it's not quite the dramatic downfall you might expect, and it all comes down to a change in the very circumstances that brought Yang Hu to power in the first place.
Okay, now I'm really curious. You're going to have to tell us all about it.
I will, but that's a story for our next deep dive.
All right, we're back, ready to finally find out what happened to Yang Hu.
Absolutely. It's a fascinating twist in the story, and I think it reveals a lot about Confucius's philosophy, too.
Okay, remind me. We left off with Yang Hu firmly in control of Lu, even after trying to bring Confucius into his government.
That's right. And remember, Confucius had predicted that Yang Hu's rule wouldn't last, but for very different reasons than what actually happened.
You mentioned it wasn't some big dramatic downfall or anything like that. So what caused his power to crumble?
Well, think back to how Yang Hu rose to prominence in the first place. It was through his military victories, right? Especially in Lu's conflicts with the neighboring state of Qi.
Yeah, he was basically the war hero. That's what gave him the leverage to outmaneuver the Sun Huan families.
Exactly. But here's the thing. Lu and Qi eventually negotiated a peace treaty.
Wait, so the wars that fueled his rise to power just stopped?
Yep, the very foundation of his authority suddenly became irrelevant.
Wow, that's wild. So what happened to Yang Hu when there was no more war to fight?
Well, without the constant threat from Qi, his influence started to fade. He wasn't the indispensable figure he once was. And the Sun Huan families, they saw their chance.
To take back control. I bet they weren't too sad to see Yang Hu lose his grip on power.
You got it. They orchestrated a political coup and forced Yang Hu into exile.
And just like that, the guy who seemed untouchable was gone.
It's a powerful reminder that even the most carefully constructed power can be fleeting, especially when circumstances change so drastically.
It's kind of poetic, isn't it? The very thing that brought Yang Hu to power ultimately led to his downfall.
For sure. But what about Confucius during all of this? Where does he fit into Yang Hu's downfall?
Yeah, good point. What was his reaction to all these sudden shifts in power?
Well, there's no evidence that he was directly involved in Yang Hu's downfall. Remember, he had chosen to focus on teaching and scholarship?
Right, he was shaping future generations, not plotting political maneuvers. But he must have had some thoughts on it all.
Oh, definitely. Even though Yang Hu's rule ended for completely different reasons than he expected, I think Confucius saw it as a validation of his worldview.
How so?
Well, Confucius always believed that true power, lasting power, doesn't come from military might or cutting strategy. It comes from cultivating virtue and moral leadership.
So Yang Hu's downfall, even if it was brought about by this random peace treaty, still kind of proves his point.
Exactly. It shows that power gained through force or ambition is often temporary and unstable, whereas a society guided by moral principles is more likely to endure.
It's a pretty timeless lesson, isn't it? No matter how much power someone has, it's their character and their commitment to what's right that really matters.
Absolutely, and I think that's one of the most enduring aspects of Confucius's legacy. His teachings emphasize that a just and harmonious society starts with each individual striving to be their best selves.
It's a powerful message, and it's really relevant even today.
Totally agree. We might not all be facing ancient power struggles, but we all have to make choices about how we use our own influence and navigate a world where things are constantly changing.
So what's the big takeaway you hope people get from this whole deep dive? What's the one thing you really want them to remember?
I think it's this. While we might not always be able to control the circumstances we face, we can control how we respond to them. Confucius showed us that even in the midst of chaos and political upheaval, we can choose to focus on cultivating virtue and wisdom, both of ourselves and in others. That's where true and lasting change begins.
Beautifully said. It's been a fascinating journey exploring Confucius's life and his impact on the world. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
It was my pleasure. And to everyone listening, keep exploring these stories from the past. You never know what insights you might uncover.
That's right. Until next time, happy deep dive. Okay.
Some historians think that Confucius, the huge philosopher,
Right.
might have had a secret half-brother.
Wow.
And not just any half-brother, but this guy Yang Hu, who was, well, let's just say,
Okay.
a powerful and kind of controversial political figure.
Yeah, that does kind of change how you think about Confucius when you hear that, doesn't it?
Yeah, it really does.
Like the champion of all this virtue and ethical leadership, and then connected to this guy Yang Hu,
Yeah.
who's all about ambition and force.
It's a big contrast, right?
Yeah, really interesting.
So I guess to even start to understand what this theory is all about,
Yeah.
we need to go back to basics.
Well-
Who is Confucius? And for that matter, who is Yang Hu?
Okay, so Confucius, well, I think a lot of people probably already know this, but just in case he was a philosopher
Right.
and a teacher living in China during the spring and autumn period, which was a really crazy time.
Yeah, it sounds pretty intense.
Tons of political upheaval and social change.
Yeah.
And Confucius's teachings, they were all about morality and justice and social harmony.
Makes sense.
He believed in the power of, education and virtue
Okay.
to create a better society. And Yang Hu, totally different guy. He was
Oh,
a
yeah.
powerful military leader.
Oh, wow. So a man of action.
Exactly. And a politician, too. Same era as Confucius. But
Okay.
he was ambitious and he was cunning, and he was definitely not afraid to kind of play dirty to get what he wanted.
Oh, wow.
History remembers him as a pretty ruthless figure, actually.
Okay.
Like he's willing to do whatever it took to get ahead.
So like the wise, peace-loving philosopher versus the ambitious, power-hungry politician. You wouldn't think they'd be, related at all, let alone half-brothers. But that's what this theory says.
I know, it's kind of wild.
What's the first clue that makes historians even think about this connection?
Well, there's this book called The Records of the Grand Historian.
Okay.
And in the biographies of Confucius section, it describes what Confucius looked like.
Okay.
And he had a very distinctive appearance.
Oh, really?
Apparently not, like a classically attractive guy.
Okay.
And pretty tall for the time.
Huh, interesting.
And in the same book,
it
describes Yang Hu.
Uh-huh.
And guess what? He looks almost exactly like Confucius.
They looked alike.
Yeah.
Really alike.
Like really alike.
I mean, that seems like a huge coincidence, especially, if Confucius had such unique features.
It does seem like more than a coincidence, right?
Yeah.
And there's even this story about Confucius being mistaken for Yang Hu.
Oh, no.
And they put him in prison because of it. Yeah, so that incident, on top of the descriptions of how similar they looked.
Yeah.
It's kind of what made people start to wonder if they were related, like maybe by blood.
I mean, yeah, that's crazy. It's not every day you hear about some famous philosopher being thrown in jail just because he looks like some politician. But so how do we go from a case of mistaken identity to saying, oh, they were half-brothers?
Right. Well, the next clue's in their family history.
Okay.
So both Confucius and Yang Hu had ties to this powerful family, the Mengson clan.
Okay.
They were super prominent back then.
Okay.
So Confucius's father, Kong, he was connected to them.
Gotcha.
And Yang Hu's family was actually a branch of the Mengson clan, too.
Wow, so they were moving in the same circles?
Exactly, like overlapping relationships and everything.
That does make it a lot more likely. I mean, they weren't just two random guys who happened to share a few features.
Right.
They were part of the same, elite social network.
Exactly. And if we dig a little deeper into Confucius's dad's life, Kong, he was, let's just say a little bit of a rebel when he was younger.
Okay.
He didn't really care about following all the social norms, and he had a pretty unconventional lifestyle.
Interesting.
So this leads to a pretty interesting theory. What if Kong, he fathered Yang Hu too?
Okay.
Maybe, outside of his marriage or something.
Oh, so we're talking like a secret love affair, a hidden scandal.
Could be.
Wow, that's pretty juicy stuff for ancient China.
Yeah.
But, I mean, what evidence is there to really back up this whole half-brother idea?
You can imagine finding hard evidence from way back then is pretty tough.
Yeah, I bet.
We're talking ancient texts and people's interpretations of things that happened centuries ago.
Right.
But there are some clues that are pretty convincing.
Okay, like what?
Okay, so Yang Hu, he also went by the name Meng Hu.
Meng Hu?
Yeah, and that name, it connects him to this really interesting passage in the Book of Rites.
Okay, I have to admit, I'm not an ancient Chinese scholar.
Sure.
What's the Book of Rites?
Okay, so basically it's this ancient text that tells you all about social norms and rituals and proper behavior in ancient China.
Gotcha.
So like a guidebook for how people were supposed to act in different situations.
Okay, interesting.
And in this book, there's this passage that mentions a Meng Hu.
Okay.
And it says he's an uncle to Confucius's half-brother, Meng Pi.
Hold on, so Yang Hu, or Meng Hu, I guess.
Yeah.
And Confucius's acknowledged half-brother, they shared the same uncle.
Yeah.
I mean, that seems like a pretty big deal.
Right.
Could this be the missing link that proves they're half-brothers?
It could be. I mean, remember we already talked about the link between their families.
Right, the Mengson clan.
Exactly. And now we've got this shared uncle, which is a much more direct genealogical connection.
Yeah.
So it definitely adds more weight to the theory that Kong, he might have fathered both of them.
This is getting good. We've got the resemblance of the shared social circle.
All right.
And now this potential family link through this uncle guy. The pieces are starting to fit together, but let's say for a second, this theory is true. Yeah. What does it tell us about Confucius and Yang Hu's relationship? I mean, they led such different lives.
They did?
How would this revelation have affected how they interacted?
Well, that's a great question. And honestly, it takes us into the realm of speculation.
Okay.
But, it's informed speculation based on what we know about them and their personalities.
Okay, I'm listening.
So imagine you're a young Yang Hu.
Okay.
You hear all these rumors about who your father really is.
Right.
And you're maybe feeling some resentment towards Confucius, the son who everyone knows and accepts.
That makes sense.
Right? Like you're the outsider.
Yeah, I can only imagine how much tension and all those complex emotions would have affected their interaction.
For sure. It definitely adds another layer to their story.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it really makes you think about them as people, not just these names in a history book.
Yeah.
But like real people with, family secrets and ambition and all that.
Exactly.
So with all this tension, bubbling under the surface, how did their relationship actually play out? As they got older, did they ever like cross paths?
Oh, they definitely crossed paths.
Good.
And it wasn't exactly friendly, let's just say that.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, there are stories about them disagreeing and power struggles, and even like this one time at a banquet where Yang Hu basically forced Confucius to leave.
What?
Yeah, like really publicly humiliated him.
So this wasn't just like, normal sibling rivalry.
No, not at all.
Wow.
We're talking about two guys with a lot of influence, both trying to grab power in this super unstable political situation.
Yeah, that's a good point. And when you think about it in the context of this possible, brotherly connection, it just adds this whole other level of intrigue, right?
For sure, you've got resentment and ambition,
Mm-hmm.
maybe even some weird sense of obligation all mixed up together.
Yeah, it's like a Shakespeare play set in ancient China. But here's where things get really interesting.
Okay.
Later on, when Yang Hu was, really powerful, he actually offered Confucius a job in his administration. Almost like an olive branch, like a chance to work together, maybe even fix their relationship.
Yeah, that's a fascinating twist.
It is Yang Hu, despite everything that had happened between them and, his reputation for being ruthless.
Right.
He still reached out to Confucius maybe as a way to, like, acknowledge their connection.
Could be. But knowing Confucius, you can probably guess what happened.
He said no.
He did. Confucius turned him down flat.
Mm-hmm.
He wanted nothing to do with Yang Hu's political machine.
Yeah, I can see that.
I mean, according to the book we're looking at, it was built on force and manipulation.
Yeah, that doesn't sound very Confucian.
No, not at all. It was everything Confucius stood against.
That's wild. I mean, to reject power, especially when it's offered by someone who could be your own brother.
Right.
Says a lot about Confucius.
It really does. I mean, what do you think scholars make of this refusal?
That's a good question. Why would he turn down such a powerful position?
Right.
Especially if it meant, maybe influencing Yang Hu from the inside.
Well, to understand that, you have to really understand Confucius's philosophy.
Okay.
His whole system of thought was about ethical leadership, right?
Mm-hmm.
Achieving harmony through virtue.
Right.
Rejecting the use of force or coercion, any of that.
Makes sense.
So if he joined forces with Yang Hu, whose methods were the complete opposite of his principles,
Yeah.
it would have been like betraying everything he believed in.
So it wasn't just about disliking Yang Hu personally or family drama?
No, it was about staying true to his core values, even if it meant giving up power and influence.
That's a powerful lesson in integrity.
It really is, especially when you think about the temptation and pressure he must have been facing.
Yeah. What do you think was going through Yang Hu's mind when Confucius rejected him?
Right. Was he mad? Did he feel betrayed?
Yeah.
Or maybe was there a part of him that understood or even respected Confucius's decision?
That's interesting. I never thought about it that way.
Yeah, historians have debated that for centuries.
Really?
Yeah, some people think Yang Hu felt insulted, like Confucius was challenging his authority.
Okay.
But others think that even though Yang Hu was ruthless on the surface,
Yeah.
he might have actually admired Confucius's principles.
That's a cool idea. It adds another layer to their relationship.
Right, like maybe underneath all the rivalry and politics, there was also some understanding or even admiration.
Yeah, but what happened next? I mean, did Yang Hu retaliate? Did he try to make life hard for Confucius?
Well, that's the crazy part. Confucius actually lived a pretty peaceful life after this, even after rejecting Yang Hu publicly.
Really?
Yeah, and that's where the author of our book proposes something really interesting.
Okay, what's that?
They think that maybe Yang Hu, even though they were so different,
Mm-hmm.
might have secretly used his power to protect Confucius.
What?
Yeah, like he made sure Confucius was safe and that none of his political enemies could mess with him.
Wait, are you saying that Yang Hu, the ruthless, power-hungry guy, was secretly looking out for Confucius, the brother who had just, rejected him?
Yeah, it does seem kind of contradictory.
Yeah, it does.
But that's what's so cool about history. It's full of these unexpected twists and turns.
For sure.
So this theory basically says that even though their relationship was complicated and full of conflict,
Right.
maybe there was also this weird sense of family duty on Yang Hu's part.
It really makes you rethink everything we thought we knew about these guys.
I know, right?
Right.
We tend to think of historical figures as being one-dimensional, like either good or bad.
Yeah.
But this story shows us that they were real people with, messy relationships and motivations that aren't so easy to categorize.
It's like peeling back the layers of time and seeing them not as like these statues on a pedestal,
Right.
but as real people struggling with their own flaws and ambitions and maybe even a sense of responsibility towards someone they secretly considered family.
Exactly. And it's in those gray areas,
Yeah.
where things aren't so clear-cut that we often find the most interesting historical insights.
So we've talked about how this potential, brotherly connection might have influenced Confucius's choices.
Yeah.
But now let's flip the script.
Okay.
How might this revelation have affected Yang Hu's own path And how history remembers him.
That is the million-dollar question, and it leads us to a really important turning point in our deep dive.
Yeah, it really makes you think differently about these guys. They're not just, the hero or the villain like in a movie.
Right, exactly.
They're more complicated than that.
Yeah, way more. And what's especially interesting is that this connection might help explain some things about Confucius's later life.
Oh, okay, how so?
Well, remember, Confucius was a scholar and teacher, right? Not like a typical politician.
Yeah.
But he traveled all over China, visiting different states, talking to rulers and officials.
That's right. He wasn't just, sitting in some library.
No, he was out there in the world trying to spread his ideas about, better society.
Okay, but what does Yang Hu have to do with all that traveling?
Well, some scholars think that those travels, especially which states he decided to visit and which ones he avoided, might have been because of Yang Hu and his political moves.
Oh, interesting, because Yang Hu was super powerful, right?
Exactly. He had influence all over the place in all his actions, his alliances, his enemies.
Right.
It created this whole complicated political landscape that Confucius couldn't just ignore.
So you're saying Confucius's travels weren't just random. He was strategically navigating a political minefield.
Exactly. Maybe trying to stay out of Yang Hu's way.
It makes you look at his journeys in a whole new light.
It does. For example, some historians think Confucius might have avoided certain states on purpose. The ones where Yang Hu was really strong.
Makes sense. Like he was saying, hey, I'm over here trying to promote virtue and good governance.
Right.
I don't want to get mixed up in your political drama.
Yeah, and remember, this was a time when different states were always fighting for power.
Right.
So if Confucius got too close to any one faction, even through family, it could have hurt his message and his ability to teach.
It's a tough position to be in, for sure.
Yeah, he had to be really careful.
It's crazy to think about all the strategy and personal stuff that might have gone into, Confucius's travels.
I know.
It also shows you the limitations he faced, even though he was becoming more and more famous.
Yeah.
Even as his teachings were spreading, he was still stuck in the system that was all about power and ambition and sometimes, just brute force.
Yeah, that's true. And it leads to another really interesting point.
Okay, what's that?
Even though he traveled and tried to stay neutral, Confucius couldn't completely escape Yang Hu.
Right.
I mean, there were stories about Confucius talking to rulers and officials who were like Yang Hu's allies or even his enemies.
Oh, wow. So even when he tried to distance himself, they kept crossing paths.
They did, either directly or indirectly.
I bet that made for some awkward conversations.
Probably. I can just imagine Confucius trying to have a calm philosophical discussion about good governance,
right,
with Yang Hu's influence hanging over everything.
It just shows how intertwined their lives were, even though they had such different ideas about leadership.
Exactly. And it makes you rethink how we interpret certain events in Confucius's life.
Okay, how so?
Were some of his conversations with rulers influenced by Yang Hu behind the scenes?
Interesting.
Were some of his teachings actually aimed at Yang Hu's methods, even if he couldn't say it directly?
It's like we're trying to solve a historical puzzle, but we only have a few pieces.
I know. It's so fascinating to imagine all that going on behind the scenes.
It really is.
And it's this mix of historical facts and educated guesses and all those unanswered questions that make this whole theory so interesting.
Yeah, it reminds us that history isn't just about dates and names.
Right.
It's about relationships and ambition and all these mysteries that still capture our imagination today.
Exactly. So we've explored this theory about Confucius and Yang Hu. We've looked at the evidence.
We sure have.
And we've talked about how it might change how we see them both.
Yeah, but let's take a step back for a second. Why does this even matter? Why should we, in the 21st century, care about some family secret from ancient China?
That's a great question. And it's not just about historical gossip.
Okay.
This deep dive makes us really think about how we understand history.
Okay, I see that.
It reminds us that the past isn't black and white.
Right.
And the people we study were real people with complex relationships and hidden motives.
Yeah, they had their own struggles that shaped their actions.
Exactly. And by understanding that, the human side of things,
right,
we get a much better appreciation for the challenges they faced, the choices they made, and the impact they had.
I have to say, this has really changed how I think about Confucius.
Yeah.
He's not just some wise guy from the past. He was a real person dealing with complicated stuff.
Yeah. And maybe even this powerful, manipulative half-brother.
Right. And it's that realization that even the most famous people had their own issues.
For sure.
It's what makes history relevant to us today.
Totally. And it reminds us that history isn't just about the past. It's about understanding the present and shaping the future.
That's a good point.
By looking at these hidden connections and questioning our assumptions about historical figures, we learn a lot about human nature and leadership and how strong family ties can be, even in the middle of political chaos.
Well said. And maybe most importantly, it reminds us to keep asking questions and keep exploring.
Right. Never stop being curious.
Exactly. Well, this has been a fascinating trip back in time.
It has.
Full of intrigue and mystery and those aha moments that make exploring history so much fun.
Absolutely. And for our listeners, if this deep dive has piqued your interest,
Oh, yeah.
we encourage you to check out the book we've been talking about, Release and Muse.
It's a great read.
Yeah. And, look into other historical mysteries about famous people.
Right.
And never stop questioning the stories we're told, because the best part of history isn't memorizing facts.
Right.
It's about uncovering those hidden connections and exploring how complicated human experiences shape the world we live in.
That's a great way to put it. Okay, so if you picture Confucius, right, like some, peaceful, like detached sage, buried in these ancient skulls, like completely removed from all the craziness of the world, well, get ready to rethink that whole image.
Yeah, it's actually kind of mind-blowing how entangled he was in all the political drama going down back then.
Okay.
Like, he wasn't just, theorizing from some ivory tower. He was dead set on becoming like a top-level statesman and shaping the future of Luda.
He wanted to get his hands dirty and fix things.
Totally.
But, as usual, the climb to power, not exactly a straight shot.
Please?
He backs Duke Zhao early on, which turned out to be not the best bet. And then there's that famous story about him turning down Yang Hu, thinking he was way too radical.
Right.
So it makes you wonder why this early reluctance towards both sides, and then BAM! Around age 50, both Yang Hu and those powerful 3 Huan families are suddenly knocking on his door.
It's a total 180, right?
Yeah.
What's that tell us about how his political game was changing?
That's the puzzle we're piecing together in this deep dive. The sources we've been combing through show Lu in this state of constant flux, and Confucius right there, smack dab in the middle, trying to keep his footing as the ground shifts beneath him.
Okay, so zoom out a little bit to the bigger picture.
Okay.
The state of Lu around the time Confucius hits 50 is anything but stable. Yeah. Another civil war kicks off, and things get real messy real fast.
And at the center of this whole storm is Yang Hu.
Right.
Who's managed to grab a good chunk of power as the chief steward for the Ji family, one of the big 3 Huan families.
Just to catch everyone up, listener,
Yeah.
These 3 Huan families were these super powerful, noble clans in Lu, and they'd built up a ton of control, often at the Duke's expense.
Yeah.
So Yang Hu, as the Ji family's main guy, he had pull, but not real legit authority, kind of operating in the shadows, and he knew it was a risky position to be in.
It's like he's pulling strings but not actually in charge.
Right.
So what does he do? Comes up with this crazy plan to solidify his power?
Yep.
Wipe out the 3 Huan families completely?
Take them out, crush their power base, the whole 9 yards.
Bold move.
Bold is putting it mildly.
But as we know, it doesn't go to plan.
Not even close.
Meng Yizi, another head honcho from the 3 Huans, and get this, a former student of Confucius, ends up playing a key role in shutting down Yang Hu's assassination plot.
Yeah.
Who fails, and we're left with this tense standoff.
It's like a game of chess with the highest stakes imaginable.
Right. 3 Huans have the Duke, they've got the capital, big advantage,
Yeah.
but they're constantly looking over their shoulders.
Like always on edge.
And that's the key point here.
Okay.
Both sides, locked in this super fragile balance of power, they suddenly see Confucius as this, like, secret weapon.
Yeah.
Someone who could swing things in their favor and shatter that deadlock.
Now you might be thinking, wait, Confucius?
Yeah.
Why him?
Yeah, why him?
Right. He wasn't exactly a political rock star up till then.
He was more of a teacher and philosopher.
Yeah. What made him so irresistible to these warring factions?
Well, the key is what Confucius was doing in the years leading up to this turning point. He'd gone all in on education, and maybe even more important, he built up this huge network of students.
Right.
And I'm not talking about kids just soaking up knowledge.
Right.
I'm talking capable people with real administrative skills and, listen to this, ambition.
He wasn't just churning out scholars.
Exactly.
He was creating a movement.
Yes.
So now, all of a sudden, this whole group of trained, motivated individuals, that's a serious source of talent and influence.
That's power.
Right. And it's such a contrast to, like, 15 years earlier during Duke Zhao's mess, when Confucius was basically begging for a job and nobody gave him the time of day.
Yeah.
Now he's leading a pack.
Yeah. All right. So picture this. We've got 2 powerful but shaky factions fighting for control, and all of a sudden, Confucius, the guy who couldn't get a foot in the door politically before, is being wooed by both sides.
What a turnaround.
So, big question for you listening. Which side would Confucius pick? The three Huan families? Kinda his old bosses, even though they were problematic?
Yeah.
Or Yang Hu? Who might have even been related to him?
This is where things get really spicy.
Okay.
The Analects, in that Yang Huo chapter, throws us a curveball.
Okay.
Mentions this guy, Gongshan Fuzhou, a steward in the Ji family, one of the three horns, launching a full-blown rebellion.
Wow.
He takes over this strategically vital city, Faiqing, and goes head-to-head with Ji Huanzi.
Faiqing was a major power center for the Ji family, basically their stronghold.
And get this, Gongshan Fuzhou calls on Confucius to join him.
Whoa!
And Confucius at first is actually thinking about going.
That is so not the Confucius we think we know.
Yes.
Like, totally clashes with the image of him as this big supporter of order and stability.
It has scholars scratching their heads even today.
Yeah.
Like, it just doesn't add up to the picture of this calm, super ethical philosopher.
Right.
But the Analects aren't fiction. They're considered pretty historically accurate.
Oh, yeah.
So we got to ask, what was going through Confucius's mind?
Yeah, what was he thinking?
Was he actually siding with a rebel, or was there something else going on?
If we zoom out again, use the Zuo's Huan to fill in some gaps, we see that Gongshan Fuzhou was a hardcore Yang Hu ally.
Oh.
So this rebellion wasn't just some random event.
No.
It was part of Yang Hu's bigger strategy against the three Huans.
Right?
So when Gongshan invites Confucius, it's basically an invite from Yang Hu's side, even if Yang Hu himself was busy with other stuff at the time.
So they're looking for any edge they can get.
Yeah. But the question is, did Confucius actually go through with it?
The answer, and luckily for his future career, is no.
Okay.
The Analects tell us that Zilu, his super devoted student, put his foot down.
Oh yeah, Zilu's not messing around.
Yeah, he basically says, Master, are you kidding? This is a disaster waiting to happen. There's got to be a better option.
Yeah.
What's interesting is how Confucius reacts.
Okay.
He doesn't just brush Zilu off.
Instead, he comes back with this grand vision, name-dropping King Wen and King Wu of Zhou, the guys who founded a dynasty known for, like, restoring order from chaos. Yeah. And he says he wants to do something similar in the East, meaning Lu, just like they did in the West.
Whoa, talk about ambition.
Yeah. It's a powerful statement, right? Shows how badly he wanted to change the political game.
Yeah.
But as our sources point out, there's this subtle hint underneath it all.
Okay.
Both Confucius and Zilu, they kind of let on that they know there's another safer option out there. So why didn't Confucius just say no to Gongshan right away? Was he actually considering it, or was this all a calculated pause?
It makes you think.
While all this was happening, the three Huan families, Yang Hu's main rivals, they were desperate to get Confucius on their side.
They needed him badly.
They saw him as this key player who could help them through this whole mess.
So let's get into their heads for a minute.
Okay.
Why would these families, who'd been, let's say, less than friendly to Confucius before, suddenly want him in their corner?
Yeah, it's a good question.
Our sources point to a few reasons.
Okay.
Starting with their very shaky position in this whole civil war.
They might have the Duke in the capital,
Yeah.
but Yang Hu's crew is still a huge threat.
Still lurking.
They basically needed someone to bring back some stability.
Right?
The old order was shattered, and they needed someone with, like, credibility, someone influential to help put things back together and solidify their power.
They'd lost their footing.
Plus, don't forget Meng Yizi's connection to Confucius.
Oh, yeah, right?
They were teacher and student once.
That's got to count for something.
That relationship probably helped a lot with communication and negotiation.
Built a bridge.
Now, got to remember the political climate in the spring and autumn period.
Okay.
It wasn't exactly a time of unwavering loyalty or rock-solid alliances.
Oh.
Power was the name of the game, and even families could turn on each other in a heartbeat.
It's a dog-eat-dog world.
Right. So old loyalties, even past grudges, they all took a back seat to staying alive and staying on top.
Survival of the fittest, politically speaking.
Now, this is where Confucius's own political philosophy kind of lines up with what the three Huans wanted.
Okay.
He was all about this hierarchical system based on what the Duke of Zhou laid down.
Okay.
Where vassals answer to the ruler, nobles answer to vassals, and so on.
Right. Everyone has their place.
And while that ultimately supports the Duke's authority, in the short term, it also gave legitimacy to these powerful families like the three Huans.
As long as they kept things running smoothly in their own territories.
So it wasn't just about siding with the stronger team for Confucius.
No.
Aligning with these families, even with all their flaws, kind of fit with his core belief in social stability.
Even if it wasn't the ideal order under the Duke.
Exactly. They weren't looking for him to, like, empower the Duke at their expense.
No way.
They wanted him to give their rule the stamp of approval.
And crucially, they wanted him to keep those lesser nobles in check.
Within their territory.
Yeah, prevent more unrest and challenges to their power.
Basically, they saw him as this, like, peacemaker and someone who'd back up their claim to power with, like, intellectual weight.
He was the brains and they were the brawns.
So what did Confucius do?
Yeah, what was his final decision?
Even though he was initially thinking about joining Gangshan in Faiqing, he ultimately goes with the three Huan families.
So what changed his mind?
Our sources offer a few possibilities.
Okay.
The simplest explanation is that he realized the three Huans had more power and that Yang Hu's side was probably losing steam.
It's the smart move.
Joining the stronger team just made strategic sense.
Right.
But there's also this intriguing idea that he might have been faking his interest in joining Yang Hu's rebellion.
Oh, playing mind games.
To get a sweeter deal from the three Huans.
Like, oh, you want me? You better make it worth my while.
It's a calculated move, a little bit of political brinkmanship.
So do we have any proof Confucius was capable of that kind of maneuvering?
Yeah, that's a good question.
It's tough to say for sure. Direct evidence is hard to come by. But there are parallels to what he did around his mother's funeral.
Okay.
Where he kind of strategically presented himself to gain some noble status.
Interesting.
Shows a practical side underneath all the idealistic goals.
So maybe he was playing the field a bit?
Yeah, ultimately, even with all the strategy, his main drive was still those political ideals.
Yeah.
He needed a platform to make his vision happen.
Yeah.
And at that time, the three Huans were the best bet.
They were the ones holding the keys.
Maybe their offer just lined up better with his long-term goals for Lu.
So what happens next?
Yeah, what's the fallout?
It's pretty remarkable, actually.
Yes,
Confucius doesn't just get some minor gig.
No.
He rockets up the ranks of Lu's political structure.
He's on the fast track.
Later on, he talks about reaching what he calls the will of heaven at 50.
Yeah.
And looking back, it seems pretty clear he saw this as his big chance to reshape Lu and build a new, more ordered society.
His time had come.
And the speed of it all is just mind-blowing. Within a year, he's the fourth highest official in Lus, right up there with the big three Huan oligarchs.
Think about that.
From relatively unknown teacher to the inner circle of power in just 12 months.
That's insane.
The Shiji, the records of the Grand Historian, lays out his early roles,
Okay.
hints at some lower-level positions to get him warmed up, but then, boom, he's appointed Minister of Justice, the Dasi coup.
That's a huge jump right into the heart of loose power structure. Something almost unheard of for someone like him.
It's like skipping all the steps and going straight to the top.
Yeah.
Now, the Minister of Justice back then, that was a big job.
Okay.
Covered everything to do with law and order, from making laws to enforcing them, running courts and prisons, the whole deal.
Sounds like a lot on his plate.
It was a huge responsibility, needed a deep understanding of how to govern.
Yeah.
But it doesn't stop there.
Oh, no.
He gets promoted again to senior minister, the Shang de Fu.
Wow.
Which puts him directly in the state council alongside the heads of the three Huan families.
So he's in the room where it happens.
Yes.
Shaping every major decision that affects Lu.
What's really significant here is that Confucius, who wasn't from one of these established noble families, reaches such a high position.
Yeah, he's an outsider.
This probably meant someone from a traditional noble lineage, maybe even from the Zhengxin family, got pushed aside.
That's got to ruffle some feathers.
It's a clean break from centuries of doing things the old way.
Driven by the three Huan's urgent need for his talents.
They needed him that badly.
It's worth pointing out that Yang Hu, powerful as he was, never got a title like this.
Right.
Confucius had the official rank and the attention of the people in charge.
So what was life like for Confucius as one of the top dogs in Luo?
Yeah, paint us a picture.
Our sources show him attending all these court ceremonies, participating in these crucial council meetings, alongside the three Huan families and the Duke, who was basically a figurehead at this point.
So he's right in the thick of it.
Yeah, but there's a catch.
Okay.
Even though he rose through the ranks quickly, he didn't actually have much hands-on experience running a big state.
So he's learning on the fly.
Exactly. With guidance and connections from, you guessed it, the three Huan families.
They're basically his mentors, whether he likes it or not.
Gotta remember, government was different back then.
Okay.
Nobles mostly ran their own little territories, their fiefdoms, instead of holding official government jobs like we think of them today, right?
So Confucius gets this mansion in Quofu, his base of operations.
Now, at first, his main focus as Minister of Justice seems to be settling disputes between all these nobles.
So he's like a referee.
Yeah, and maybe a less demanding job, which he often handed off to his capable students, like Zilu.
Zilu was always the efficient one.
And Confucius's whole philosophy of justice, you can see it in the Analects.
Okay.
He was all about fairness and finding peaceful solutions.
Over strict rules and harsh punishments.
Yeah, he wanted both sides to see each other's point of view and prevent future conflict.
A very people-centric approach.
Absolutely. All those years of teaching really paid off. Because when Yang Hu left, there were gaps to fill. And his students, who were skilled, eager, and loyal, stepped right in.
They were ready.
And let's not forget the perks.
Oh yeah, everyone loves a good perk.
His salary was massive, hundreds of thousands of caddies of grain.
Whoa.
Remember, coins weren't the main currency yet.
Right.
This was a big difference from the three Huan families, who got most of their wealth from their land.
I weren't going to give him land, but they definitely paid him well.
So now he's established himself in Luna's leadership, right? Confucius is ready to chase his bigger vision.
Okay.
This is his second major transformation.
After going from commoner to someone with noble connections.
He's gone from scholar to high-ranking official.
It's like leveling up in a video game.
But this new power, it came with strings attached.
Oh yeah, nothing's free.
The three Huans didn't promote him out of the goodness of their hearts.
Yeah,
They wanted results.
What were they expecting from him?
Their top priority was clear. Clean up Yang Hu's mess and improve Lu's reputation on the world stage.
They needed damage control.
Yang Hu's actions had destabilized everything, not just Lu itself, but the whole balance of power in the region.
It was like a ripple effect.
And here's the thing. It's pretty rare for a minister of justice, someone who's supposed to focus on law and order inside the state,
Right.
to be given big diplomatic responsibilities.
Yeah, it's not their usual gig.
This shows how extraordinary the situation was and how much the three Huans needed him.
So what made Confucius, with his background in teaching and ethics, the right guy for this job?
That's a good point.
Right.
It wasn't that he was some master diplomat.
No.
It was his moral authority and his network.
Okay.
The three Huans probably figured his reputation for integrity and his connections in other states, which he built up while traveling with Duke Zhao, would be valuable assets in rebuilding alliances.
They were banking on his reputation.
The situation was pretty dire for Lu.
Okay.
The state was weak and isolated after Yang Hu's rebellion.
And they had no allies.
And one big worry was Yang Hu himself.
Oh yeah, what's he up to?
He'd gone to the powerful state of Jin, found himself a patron in Zhao Jianzi, a real power player in Jin.
Not good.
So to counter this threat, Lu needed to make some friends, and the most logical partner was Jin's longtime rival, the state of Qi.
Okay.
But that wasn't so easy.
Why not?
Relations between Lu and Qi had been strained for years.
Oh yeah.
Ever since Duke Zhao was exiled to Qi.
Right.
But here's where Confucius's past comes in handy.
Okay.
Years earlier, when he was with Duke Zhao in exile in Qi, he'd gotten to know the Qi elite, including Duke Jing himself.
So he had some insider knowledge.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Gave him a level of familiarity the three Huans just didn't have.
That's got to be valuable.
At first, he focuses on figuring out if Qi was even open to an alliance.
Testing the waters.
And while the details are a little fuzzy, we know he sent his students to Qi.
Okay.
The Analects even mentioned some back and forth about their travel expenses.
Oh, the logistical stuff.
Yeah. But Qi was interested. They saw a benefit in teaming up with Lu against Jin.
Enemy of my enemy is my friend.
By the summer of his 52nd year, Confucius had set up a big summit between Lu and Qi at Jiagu, a strategically important spot.
Okay.
He was like the event planner, handling all the details.
Making sure everything runs smoothly.
This meeting at Jiagu becomes one of his big diplomatic achievements.
Okay. Tell me about it.
Now, the Zhuan gives this pretty dramatic account of the summit.
Oh, yeah.
Claims that Qi tried to kidnap Duke Ding of Lu during the whole thing,
Jeez,
using local tribesmen to do their dirty work.
That's sneaky.
But Confucius steps in, confronts the Qi reps, makes sure the Duke's safe.
Sounds like a scene from a movie.
It's a good story, but our sources also suggest a more likely scenario.
Okay.
The summit probably went pretty well.
Less exciting.
Yeah, both Qi and Lu had a strong reason to team up against Jin.
A common enemy.
Qi was already fighting Jin, so stirring up trouble with Lu through a kidnapping just wouldn't make sense.
Yeah, that'd be counterproductive.
The Zhuan, being from Lu's perspective, might have jazzed up the story a bit.
To make Confucius look like a hero.
Right, and to emphasize how important the Lu delegation was.
Okay, so propaganda mixed with history.
Exactly. Later accounts, like in the Warring States period and Sima Qian's Shiji, they just amped up the drama even more.
So who knows what really went down?
But regardless of all the theatrics, the outcome was a big win for Lu.
They got what they wanted.
Qi and Lu officially became allies against Jin, and Qi even gave back some land they'd taken from Lu before.
Not bad.
But Confucius doesn't stop there.
He's on a roll.
He brings in the states of Zheng and Wei.
Wow, building a coalition.
Both of them had their own issues with Jin because of what Yang Hu had done during his time calling the shots in Lu.
So Yang Hu's legacy is coming back to bite them.
Yeah, by the time he's 53, Confucius has created this four-state Eastern anti-Jin alliance.
That's a major power move.
It's a huge diplomatic win.
Yeah.
Strengthens Lu's security and raises their profile in the region.
So what's next on his agenda?
Well, with all that diplomacy sorted out, Confucius turns his attention to this long-standing internal problem in Luga.
Okay.
The three Huan families having way more power than the Duke.
Back to the power struggle.
His solution. Bold, maybe even a little risky.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
The demolishing the three capitals plan.
That sounds serious.
The idea was to weaken the three Huans militarily by taking down the walls of their fiefdoms, which had gotten as big and powerful as the capital itself, Quofu.
So he's going right for their source of power.
It's a direct challenge to their independence and influence.
Pretty audacious considering he owes his position to them.
Yeah, the irony isn't lost on us.
No.
But for Confucius, his commitment was to this bigger vision of order.
Even if it meant shaking things up for the people who helped him climb the ladder.
What does that say about his priorities?
Shows where his true loyalty lies.
His strategy's pretty smart, though.
Okay, how so?
He starts with Feiqing, Jiwanzi's stronghold, which is controlled by Gongshan Furao, Yang Hu's old buddy.
Using that connection.
Exactly. His past contact with Gongshan becomes a strategic advantage.
He's playing the long game.
But it's a mixed bag in terms of results.
Okay.
Shu Sin Wushu, probably the weakest of the three Huan leaders politically, goes ahead and dismantles the walls of his capital.
So one down.
But Feiqing, that's a tougher nut to crack.
What happens?
Gongshan Furao attacks Quofu directly.
Wow, bold move.
Tries to capture Duke Ding.
So they're upping the stakes.
Confucius and his students, including Zilu, they defend Corfu,
Okay.
fight off Gongshan's attack, and eventually take back Feiqing.
Nice.
Zilu's put in charge of the city, and he appoints this young guy, Gao Chai, to a key position.
Even though Confucius wasn't so sure about him.
Yeah, thought he was too inexperienced.
But Zilu's like, hey, you learn by doing.
Turns out he was right.
Practical guy.
Now, Meng Yizi, he wasn't exactly enthusiastic about the whole plan.
Dragging his feet.
Pretends to be on board by staging a little rebellion in Qingyi.
It doesn't actually commit.
And the walls there stay up.
So, bottom line. Demolishing the three capitals mostly fails.
Yeah.
Probably cost Confucius some trust with the three Huan families.
They weren't happy about their power being challenged.
Understandable.
But it might have earned him some points with the Duke.
Who would benefit from the nobles having less power?
It's a perfect example of how Confucius was constantly trying to balance his ideals with the realities of politics.
Trying to do what's right while playing the game.
So, to wrap up our deep dive today,
Okay.
we've seen that Confucius was way more than just a philosopher.
Yeah.
He was a practical, ambitious political player who jumped at the chance to make a real difference in Lucy.
He wasn't just sitting on the sidelines?
His rise to power at 50 was fast and strategic.
A meteoric rise.
He had big diplomatic wins.
Yeah.
And faced some tough challenges trying to put his reforms into action.
It's a more complicated story than we usually hear.
Definitely challenges the idea of him as just an academic.
Yeah.
He was a master strategist, navigating the tricky world of spring and autumn period politics with this mix of idealism and, let's face it, cunning.
He was playing chess while everyone else was playing checkers.
So here's a final thought for you to ponder.
Okay.
Given how Confucius mixed those high ideals with strategic moves,
Yeah,
what do you think was his ultimate measure of success?
that's a good question.
Was it the alliances he built, his short but influential time in high office, or the lasting impact of his teachings?
All those things had an impact.
And maybe even more important, how relevant are his experiences navigating power and making change to the challenges we face in the world today?
That's a question worth thinking about.
We encourage you to keep exploring the spring and autumn period and Confucius's legacy.
Yeah,
There's always more to discover when you dig a little deeper.
definitely.
And that's our deep dive for today.
See you next time.
Take care.
Bye. We're the big one today.
We are, yeah. A name everyone's heard of, but a part of his life that maybe gets glossed over a bit.
Exactly. Confucius. Everyone knows the name, but we're zeroing in on, I guess you could call it, his political years.
Yeah, his time in the state of Lu trying to, well, be a politician. Yeah.
Not exactly the image that comes to mind when you think Confucius.
Yeah. Given all this, given the impending political struggles in Luva, could Confucius have possibly held on to his position? What challenges would he have faced, and how might his experiences, his interactions with Duke Ding, his own reflections on power and morality have shaped his actions?
But to really understand his philosophy, his impact, this period's crucial.
Absolutely, and that's what we're diving into today, specifically Confucius and this ruler, Duke Ding of Lu.
Not the most powerful guy, was he?
Nope, not by a long shot. The sources we've got paint a picture of Lu, kind of like a puppet state.
Puppet state. Okay, I like that. So who were the puppet masters pulling the strings?
These powerful clans, the three Huan families they're called, and a figure, Yang Hu, they basically ran the show.
So Duke Ding, while technically the ruler, had very limited authority. He was stuck dealing with these powerful nobles who were really calling the shots.
Right. And that's the backdrop for Confucius entering the scene. What's interesting is how Confucius acted in this environment.
From what I was reading, very improperly, like by the book.
Exactly. Our sources emphasize how meticulous he was in observing courtly etiquette, especially when interacting with Duke Ding. Complete contrast to the three Huan, who apparently didn't bother so much.
Oh, that's got a sting for the Duke. Seeing these upstart nobles disrespecting him, and then there's Confucius, all proper and deferential. It's like a silent commentary on who's got real class, you know?
You can see how that would appeal to a duke who's been sidelined by these powerful families. And there's another layer here. Remember Confucius's earlier attempt to weaken the three Huan, the demolition of the three capitals?
Right, that didn't go so well. But it shows that, at least at that point, Confucius and Duke Ding were on the same page. They both wanted to see the Duke's authority restored. So from Duke Ding's perspective, getting Confucius closer must seem like a good move.
Absolutely. But our sources emphasize the danger here for Duke Ding. Any open move towards Confucius, any hint of a political alliance could alert the three Huan and make his position even worse.
So they're stuck in this weird dance. Duke Ding wanting Confucius on his side, but having to play it cool, not make any sudden moves.
Exactly. And this brings us to their first recorded conversation, as seen in the Analects. On the surface, it seems like a pretty straightforward question from Duke Ding. He asks something like, shouldn't a ruler command his ministers and ministers serve the ruler?
This is pretty basic, right?
It does. But Confucius's answer is crucial. He says, a ruler should employ his ministers under the guidance of rituals, and ministers should serve the ruler with the attitude of loyalty.
Okay, classic Confucius, right? Ritual and loyalty. But there's more to it than that, isn't there? Especially when you consider the power dynamics we've been talking about.
When he talks about rituals, he's not just referring to ceremonies. He's talking about the entire established order, the traditions that everyone, even the Duke, is bound by.
So it's like Confucius is gently reminding Duke Ding that he's not an absolute monarch. He can't just boss people around, especially not the three Huan. He has to operate within the existing system.
Exactly. And for our listeners, this is key to understanding Confucius's political philosophy. He's not advocating for blind obedience to a ruler. It's all about balance, about everyone fulfilling their roles within the established order.
And that order, at least in Lu, included some very powerful nobles that the Duke had to contend with.
Right. Now, the next conversation, the sources suggest it was probably more private, gets even more interesting. Duke Ding asks about a single sentence that could bring prosperity or collapse to a country.
Okay, now he's getting to the point, isn't he? It's like he's saying, Confucius, you're a smart guy. Tell me what to do to fix this mess.
It does sound that way, doesn't it? He's almost seeking a magic solution, that one perfect move to turn things around.
And how does Confucius respond?
Very carefully. He doesn't give Duke Ding a simple answer. Instead, he talks about the difficulty of being both a ruler and a minister. He says, if you can really understand the difficulties of being a ruler, then there is somewhat the meaning of a single sentence can bring about the prosperity of a country.
He's saying it's not about finding the right words. It's about understanding and empathy. That's a pretty nuanced answer for a guy who's supposed to be all about following rules, you know.
It is. And it's important to remember that Confucius wasn't against political power. He just believed it had to be exercised responsibly, ethically.
So no quick fix for Duke Ding.
No. And then Duke Ding takes it a step further, asking about a single sentence that could cause collapse.
Now this feels like a test. He wants to see where Confucius's loyalties lie. Is he with the Duke or with the three Huan?
It's a very loaded question, isn't it? And again, Confucius's answer is ambiguous. He warns against a ruler who issues unreasonable commands that are blindly followed. He says that that kind of single sentence could lead to ruin.
So on the surface, he's just giving generic advice. But given the context, it sounds like he's subtly warning Duke Ding against making any rash moves, like trying to get rid of the three Huan by force.
Exactly. He's saying, don't repeat the mistakes of the past. Violence won't solve anything.
Okay, so based on these conversations, it seems like Confucius, even though he sympathizes with Duke Ding's position, is not about to become his political attack dog.
Right. He's not looking to form an alliance against the three Huan. He seems to be aiming for a peaceful coexistence where everyone respects their roles within the existing hierarchy.
A delicate balancing act, to say the least.
Absolutely. Their interactions are subtle, but there's a definite undercurrent of danger, given the ever-present power of the three Huan.
So far, we've seen Confucius maneuvering through this political minefield. Now I'm curious, how did he feel about all this? About being an official, dealing with these powerful figures?
Well, the Analects does give us some glimpses into his mindset during this period. He reflects on what he's learned, what he's gained, and how he's managed to stay true to his principles while navigating the messy world of politics.
And, there's this surprisingly human element to it. He compares himself to some of his old friends who never achieved his level of success, who remained poor.
Right. It's a reminder that even Confucius, the sage, wasn't immune to a little bit of human pride, comparing himself to others. But the source is careful to point out that his criticism wasn't directed at everyone from humble beginnings.
It was about their motivation. It was about those who sought office purely for personal gain, who were in it for themselves and not for the good of the people. He calls them anxious for fear of loss.
A great phrase, isn't it? And so relevant even today. Think about how many people are driven by that fear, that sense of scarcity, instead of a genuine desire to serve.
He also seems to have had very little patience for those armchair scholars, the ones who complained about everything but couldn't actually get anything done.
Yeah, all talk and no action.
But what's interesting is how Confucius's views seem to change during this period. He becomes more pragmatic. The course talks about him embracing the idea of saving the country by a circuitous route, which suggests he's willing to compromise, to be flexible, to achieve his goals.
He's moving away from that idealistic black and white thinking.
And this leads him to believe that some of his old colleagues, the ones who clung to rigid principles, were politically naive.
Right. He's seeing the world in shades of gray now. And this brings us to a pretty major twist. Confucius, after 6 years in office, gets promoted to acting Grand Minister of Land.
Wait, what? The highest position in Luoyang.
Yep. And according to Sima Qinan, he was 56 years old at this time.
But this doesn't make sense. Why would the three Huan, the very people he'd been trying to undermine, promote him to such a powerful position?
That's the big question, isn't it? The source suggests a few possibilities. Were they setting a trap, trying to control him from within? Were Confucius's own disciples worried about this? According to Sima Qian's records of the Grand Historian, they were. One even warned Confucius to be careful. But Confucius, it seems, was optimistic, believing he could use this opportunity to make a real difference.
This is where it gets really interesting and a bit controversial. This is when the story of Confucius executing Xiao Zhengmao comes in.
Ah, yes, the supposed execution.
Sima Qian describes this Xiao Zhengmao as a doctor of the state of Lu, someone who is disrupting the government. Sounds like a serious threat.
It does. But here's where the story takes a sharp turn. Our source makes a compelling argument that this entire event was likely a fabrication by later generations.
Hold on. You're saying the execution of Xiao Zhengmao never happened?
That's the argument, and a strong one. Think about it. The Analects, the Book of Rites, both compiled by Confucius's disciples, they don't mention Xiao Zhengmao at all. Not a word about this supposed execution.
If it was such a big deal, why wouldn't they include it? It's not like they were trying to hide Confucius's flaws. They're pretty honest about his mistakes.
Exactly. They even record instances where he was wrong or made poor decisions. So the absence of this supposedly major event is very telling.
Okay, so if it's not in the early sources, where does this story even come from?
The earliest mention we can find is in the Zunzi, a text from the late Warring States period, centuries after Confucius's death. And even there, it's not a straightforward account of a criminal being punished.
What is it then?
The Zunzi portrays Xiao Zhengmao as more of an intellectual opponent, They say he held dangerous ideas, behaved strangely, spoke persuasively but with false words, and was gathering people, causing unrest.
So it's an ideological clash, battle of ideas.
Exactly. And it's important to note that this idea of a contention of 100 schools of thought, this clash of different philosophies, wasn't really a thing during Confucius's lifetime. It developed later.
Right, so this story might be projecting a later intellectual conflict back onto Confucius.
That's one possibility. And then later on, during the Eastern Han Dynasty, Wang Shang's Luoyang adds even more detail, claiming that Xiao Zhengmao opposed Confucius in education and even tried to steal his students.
So it becomes this whole dramatic narrative. And over time, the Confucius executing Xiao Zhengmao's story turns into a kind of historical justification for sages using force when necessary.
Right, but if you look at Confucius's other teachings, his emphasis on persuasion, on moral example, on leading by virtue, it just doesn't add up.
And our source points out that if Xiao Zhengmao was such an influential figure, surely there'd be some record of his ideas, his followers, somewhere. But there's nothing.
Just this one account in the Zunzi. And even there, it's not a clear-cut case of a crime being punished. It's framed as an ideological struggle.
Plus, there's that story in the Analects, where someone asks Confucius about killing a deviant person to promote goodness, and Confucius basically says, no, you can't force people to be good, you have to lead by example. He uses that analogy of the wind and the grass.
A powerful image, right? The wind blowing, the grass bending. It's about influence, not coercion.
So putting it all together, the missing evidence, the later sources, the inconsistency with Confucius's other teachings, it seems pretty clear that this execution story is likely a fabrication.
That's the conclusion our source reaches, and it's a compelling one. They even suggest that Zunzi might have invented this story to justify suppressing his own philosophical opponents.
Which, if you think about it, is kind of ironic. They're using Confucius, the advocate for virtue and harmony, to justify silencing dissenting views.
It's a great example of how history can be manipulated to serve different agendas. And for our listeners, it's a reminder to always be critical of the stories we're told, to dig deeper, to look for alternative perspectives.
Absolutely. So, if this execution didn't happen, what was Confucius doing during his time as acting Grand Minister of Land? What do the sources say?
They point to him focusing on more practical matters, improving social morality, public order.
Like what kind of things specifically?
Apparently, market behavior improved in Quofu, and public conduct became more orderly. It sounds like he was focused on building a stronger ethical foundation within the state.
Makes sense. No big sweeping reforms like trying to demolish those capitals again.
No, it seems like the focus shifted to more immediate concerns, probably maintaining stability and trying to navigate the complex political situation.
Okay, so let's recap. We've got Duke Ding stuck between a rock and a hard place, trying to cautiously enlist Confucius's help. But Confucius, ever the pragmatist, isn't about to be anyone's pawn. He plays the game carefully, offering advice, but ultimately staying true to his own principles.
And then we've got this myth of the execution, which, when you really examine it, falls apart. It's a later fabrication, probably meant to serve someone else's agenda.
Really highlights how history can be distorted, how stories can be changed and reshaped to fit certain narratives.
Absolutely. So, final question for our listeners. Given all this, given the impending political struggles in Luva, could Confucius have possibly held on to his position? What challenges would he have faced, and how might his experiences, his interactions with Duke Ding, his own reflections on power and morality have shaped his actions? It's a reminder that even great figures like Confucius were constantly navigating complex situations, trying to balance their ideals with the realities of power.
They were really zeroing in on a specific moment, a real turning point in Confucius's life.
That's right. We're looking at the end, the rather sudden end, of his political career in his home state. Lu looked promising for a while, didn't it?
It really did. And we've got some fascinating source material that sheds light on his time as acting Grand Minister of Land and People.
And crucially, the political struggles, the sort of undertows that pushed him out. It's a chapter that, well, maybe gets overlooked sometimes.
But it's key, isn't it, to understanding his path, his philosophy even?
Absolutely.
So our mission today is to try and unpack this whole political drama. Why did this seemingly successful stint end so abruptly?
Yeah, he had support. He was making changes.
Right. So we need to navigate this tangle of alliances, the shifting priorities of these powerful families.
And Confucius's own principles, which definitely played a huge role. See how it all kind of unraveled.
Okay, so where do we start? His moment of greatest influence, perhaps?
Good place. So, age 56. Our sources put him right at this peak. Acting Grand Minister of Land and People. A significant position.
And a real chance to implement some of his ideas, right, to reform Lu society.
Exactly. He wasn't just a theorist at this point. He was in the thick of it, trying to make changes.
And initially, he had backing from the big families, the three Huans.
That seems clear, yeah. Especially Ji Huanzi and Shisun Wushu. They were, well, younger leaders then.
And they needed him. Why?
Primarily, it seems, to help them consolidate their own power against rivals like Yang Hu. Confucius offered legitimacy, maybe administrative skill.
Ah, okay, so he's useful to them.
Very useful. But, and this is crucial, it seems to have been a temporary alignment, more about their needs than a deep belief in Confucius, perhaps.
Because things changed.
They did. After about, 5 or 6 years, the sources suggest Yang Hu's rebellion is crushed. He's dealt with.
And the three Huan families are now firmly in control.
Exactly. Their position is secure. And suddenly, Confucius, well, he's not quite so essential to keeping them in power anymore.
And does this tie into maybe an underlying dislike or distrust of him from the start?
I think that's fair to say based on what happened next. Even when they supported him, there was likely tension. Because Confucius wasn't just going to be their puppet, was he?
No. His actions, like that demolishing the 3 fortified towns initiative.
Right. That was aimed at strengthening the Duke of Lu's authority, Duke Ding.
Which directly undercut the 3 Huan family's power.
Precisely. His loyalty, fundamentally, was to the Duke, to the traditional structure, not to these oligarchs.
Right.
And they knew it. That created friction.
So internal politics were already getting tricky. What about the bigger picture, internationally?
Also shifting. You have Yang Hu escaping to the state of Jin.
Okay, so that's a potential threat from outside Lu.
Could be. And initially, that actually increased Confucius's value,
Yeah.
His diplomatic skills were needed. He was involved in building this Eastern anti-Jin alliance.
To counter Jin and maybe Yang Hu's influence there.
Exactly. But then something kind of unexpected happens. Civil war breaks out within Jin.
Ah, okay. So Jin is suddenly preoccupied internally.
Right. You've got Zhao Jianzi and his allies fighting the Fan and Zonghang clans. And Lu, being part of that Eastern alliance, finds itself opposing Zhao Jianzi.
So Lu is now openly at war, or at least in conflict, with a faction in Jin. You'd think Confucius, the alliance builder, would be more vital than ever.
Logically, yes. But politics isn't always logical, is it? The sources suggest the opposite.
Really? How so?
Well, with Lu now united in open conflict against this Jin faction, the specific need for Confucius's subtle diplomacy sort of faded for the 3 Huan families.
And maybe their fear of him secretly colluding with Yang Hu also lessened, now that Lu had a clear enemy in Jin.
That seems to be the thinking, yes. The national unity, such as it was against Jin, made Confucius's unique position less critical and perhaps less dangerous to them.
Wow. It's quite cynical.
Politics often is. One source uses a really stark analogy. When the rabbit is dead, the dog is cooked.
Oof. Meaning Confucius, the hunting dog, was no longer needed once the prey, Yang Hu and the immediate Jin threat, was dealt with.
That's the interpretation. His usefulness in their specific pragmatic view just evaporated. Doesn't matter how wise or capable he was overall.
Chilling. So his influence wanes. But did it become actively dangerous for him? You mentioned threats?
The Analects do hint at that, yeah. Threats against him, against his disciples, imprisonment, maybe even worse.
Who would be behind that? Just the 3 Huan families, or?
Likely broader than just them. The thinking is that Confucius's disciples getting placed in official posts, well, they were stepping on toes.
The toes of the established nobility.
Yeah.
People who felt their own paths were being blocked.
Exactly. These older nobles, probably resentful, saw their chance when the 3 Huan families started pulling back their support for Confucius. Time to strike back.
And the first attack came from an unexpected place. Inside his own circle.
Sort of. A disciple named Gong Bolio, not one of the most famous ones.
What did he do?
He accused Zilu, Confucius's top disciple, really loyal, of disloyalty. And Zilu was serving as chief steward for Ji Huanzi himself.
Wow, that's incredibly messy. Accusing the boss's right-hand man, who's also your teacher's top student.
It really shows you the kind of treacherous political environment they were in. Internal strife, betrayals, even within families or teacher-student groups, it seems, wasn't uncommon. Ambition trumped loyalty.
How did Confucius find out about this?
Through another figure, Zifu Jingbo, described as a kind of half-disciple connected to the Meng Xinshi family, another of the 3 Huans.
And Zifu Jingbo offered to...
What, take Gong Bolio down?
Essentially, yeah. Offered to deal with him, bring him to justice, which is quite an offer, really.
But Confucius refused. Why?
His stated reason was about fate, destiny controlling his political path, that Gong Bolio couldn't really affect it.
Which sounds noble, but maybe a bit fatalistic.
Well, yes. But there's likely a deeper layer. The interpretation is that Confucius probably saw Gong Bolio not as the main threat, but as a pawn.
A pawn in a bigger game, played by others trying to undermine him.
Exactly. He recognized this was part of a larger opposition movement. Focusing just on Gong Bolio would miss the point. He understood the real forces working against him.
Smart, but also maybe a sign he knew things were really turning against him.
I think so. And the pressure didn't let up. We hear about more trouble for his disciples, lawsuits, even imprisonment.
Who else?
2 names stand out, Gong Qicheng and Nanrong. Both ended up in jail.
And how did Confucius react to that? Did he distance himself?
Quite the opposite. It's really revealing about his character. With Gong Qicheng, Confucius insisted he was innocent.
Okay.
And then he declared him a suitable husband for his own daughter, and the marriage actually happened.
While he was still under a cloud, possibly even in prison. That's a massive statement of support.
Absolutely. Publicly standing by his guy, taking him into the family. He wasn't cutting ties to save himself.
What about Nanrong? Similar story.
Similar conviction in his innocence. Confucius arranged for Nanrong to marry his niece.
Another family tie forged under pressure.
Yes. And Confucius said something interesting about Nanrong, that in a well-run state, he wouldn't be neglected, but in chaotic times, he'd avoid execution.
He'd avoid death. That implies Nanrong was in real danger of being executed.
It strongly suggests that, yes, the situation was potentially lethal.
How did Nanrong get out of it if he was facing that kind of charge?
It's a fascinating little detail. Apparently, he avoided the worst by repeatedly reciting lines from the Book of Songs.
Reciting poetry. How did that help?
The lines were, "The flaws on a white jade can still be polished away, but the flaws in words can never be undone."
So by sticking to these lines, essentially staying silent on the accusations.
He gave his accusers nothing concrete. No flawed words, no self-incriminating statements they could use to build a capital case against him, or perhaps against Confucius through him.
Clever. Using silence, framed by classic texts, as a defense.
It seems to have worked. A wise move that likely saved his life.
And through all this, Confucius's loyalty is just unwavering, forming family bonds with disciples in deep trouble.
It's remarkable. He wasn't a timid politician looking to protect his own skin. He felt responsible for his followers.
And you have to think that kind of loyalty breeds loyalty in return, right?
Immensely so. Our sources stress this. It fostered this incredibly deep, lasting devotion from his disciples that's, well, quite rare and a huge part of his legacy. It wasn't just ideas, it was personal commitment tested by fire.
Okay, so the pressure is building, disciples are being targeted, the conflict with the 3 Huan families is becoming more open.
Yes, it's escalating publicly, but Confucius, interestingly, is still reluctant to just quit.
Hang on. Pride. Principle.
Probably principle, mainly.
Yeah.
He likely still believed he was serving the Duke, serving the state of Lu itself, not just these powerful families. He didn't want to concede that they were the state.
So what was Ji Huanzi's next move? He couldn't just fire him outright easily.
Apparently not. Sacking such a respected figure might have caused backlash. So the strategy seems to have been more about sidelining him, making his position untenable without a formal dismissal.
A sort of political freezing out?
Exactly. And this is where Duke Jing of Qi comes back into the story, but in a different way.
Not offering him a job this time.
No, quite the opposite. Duke Jing sends this troupe of beautiful and talented female dancers as a gift to Lu.
Okay. A diplomatic gift or something more?
Oh, definitely more. It was a classic political maneuver. Ji Huanzi then arranges an outing with Duke Ding of Lu.
The ruler of Lu.
Right. And he takes the Duke to see the dancers, keeps him entertained, and conspicuously makes sure the Duke misses a scheduled meeting with Confucius.
A deliberate public snub, sending a very clear message.
Unmistakable. Your access to the Duke is cut off. You're out of favor.
How did Confucius react? Did Zilu advise him?
Zilu was in a tough spot, wasn't he? Steward to Ji Huanzi, disciple to Confucius.
Yeah.
He apparently advised Confucius, maybe gently, to leave Lu for a while. Change the scenery, let things cool down, perhaps.
But Confucius was stubborn.
Seems so. Still clinging to his post, to his duty as he saw it. Principled, maybe, but perhaps not politically savvy at this point.
So Ji Huanzi had to force the issue more directly.
It came down to what the sources call cold treatment. specifically involving a state ritual.
Okay, what happened?
After a major imperial sacrifice, there was a tradition of distributing portions of the sacrificial meat to high-ranking officials, a sign of status and inclusion.
A perk of the job, showing you're part of the inner circle.
Exactly. And Huanzi deliberately ensures that Confucius does not receive his portion.
Wow. In front of everyone.
Presumably, yes, or at least it would become known very quickly. It was a direct public humiliation, a massive loss of face.
That must have been the final straw.
It seems it was. He couldn't ignore that. He finally had to accept that there was no hope left for him in the Loop administration. He had to find an excuse to resign.
So he gives up the power, the position. What was his status then?
He still kept the honorary title of Grand Master, but without the actual job, the income, the hereditary land that might come with it. His position was suddenly very insecure.
Back to being a scholar, essentially, but one who'd just been publicly pushed out.
Pretty much. And it wasn't just him. The fallout hit his key allies, too.
Zilu and Zigong.
Yeah, both lost their official positions shortly after Confucius resigned. A clean sweep, really. The three Huans removed the whole group associated with Confucius and his reform ideas.
So it looks like a complete failure, doesn't it? From a political perspective, back to square one almost.
To an outsider at the time, it might have seemed that way, just another official who rose and fell. But our sources suggest this was a really critical moment of choice for Confucius. He wasn't just pushed, he faced alternatives.
What kind of alternatives? What could he have done differently, realistically?
Well, one path was to basically switch sides, become a sort of intellectual spokesperson for the three Huan families.
How would that work?
He could have used his knowledge, his authority on the rights of Zhu, those ancient texts on governance, to reinterpret them, to create new theories that actually legitimize the family's growing autocratic power.
Give them an ideological cover for what they were doing.
Exactly. And had he done that, he probably could have secured a very comfortable, high-status, and stable position for himself, become their court philosopher, essentially.
Yeah, that's one option in the others.
Another path involved leveraging his own background. Remember, he had noble ancestry from the state of Song.
Right.
He could have focused on building power through kinship, arranging strategic marriages, perhaps for himself or his children, with the three Huan families.
Forging alliances through family ties.
Yes, building a powerful network within Li's elite, potentially carving out his own space, maybe becoming a fourth major oligarchic power himself.
Those are significant possibilities he seemed to have rejected.
He consciously chose not to take those paths. He prioritized his ideals, what he called the way, over personal power, wealth, or even political success in that conventional sense.
And that choice is central to his legacy.
Our sources argue it is his greatness. Not that he achieved worldly success like becoming a prime minister, but that he navigated this incredibly difficult situation, making compromises perhaps, but ultimately refusing to abandon his core principles for personal gain. That balance between morality and engagement.
That's a powerful point. So after this dismissal, this forced resignation, how must he have felt?
You have to imagine a real sense of loss, disappointment, maybe bitterness. Plus, dealing with the gossip, the "I told you so" from acquaintances, it couldn't have been easy.
Definitely not. So he decides to leave Lu, following Zilu's earlier advice.
Yes, seems he finally took that advice, decided a change of scenery was needed, and he chose to head to the state of Qi.
Qi again. Why T specifically?
Several reasons made it a logical choice. He'd lived there before, as we know.
Right.
Also, relations between Lu and Qi had actually been fairly decent during his time in office, despite underlying rivalries. And he did have that prior acquaintance with Duke Jing of Qi, familiar ground to some extent.
Okay. Now, there's a timing issue here, isn't there? With Sima Qian's famous history book.
Yes, the Records of the Grand Historian. It places Confucius's main trip to Qi much earlier, when he was younger, after Duke Zhao of Lu went into exile.
But the sources we're looking at argue this trip, the one after his dismissal, happened later, around age 56.
They make a strong case for it, yes. And the key evidence revolves around how Duke Jing of Qi considered receiving Confucius this time.
What was the issue?
The Duke reportedly debated what level of protocol to use. Should Confucius be treated like Mang Yizhi or like Ji Huanzi? These were major figures in Lu's hierarchy.
Ah, so that comparison only makes sense if Confucius himself had recently held a very high rank in Lu.
Exactly. It wouldn't have been a relevant benchmark if Confucius was just a relatively unknown scholar in his 30s, as Sima Qian's timeline might suggest for an earlier trip. This points strongly to the post-dismissal timing.
Got it. So he gets to Qi,
received with some level of consideration, but he wasn't happy there either.
Well, C. McKean suggests dissatisfaction with the reception itself, but our sources lean towards a different reason for his discontent.
Which was?
Less about personal treatment, more about the lack of real opportunity. He wasn't just looking for a comfortable retirement or exile. He still wanted meaningful political work.
And Duke Jing didn't offer him a significant role. Why not?
From Duke Jing's perspective, it was probably pragmatic politics again. Confucius didn't have deep roots or a power base in Qi.
And appointing him prominently might upset Lu, especially the three Huan families he'd just fallen out with.
Precisely. It could complicate relations between the states. So Duke Jing was likely cautious. Welcoming, perhaps, but not willing to give him real power.
So Confucius finds himself adrift again, in a sense. Still ambitious, still looking for a place to make a difference.
Yeah, it seems he found it hard to adapt to being outside the political arena. He continued looking for openings in other states.
And meanwhile, back in Lu, were the three Huan families just forgetting about him?
Unlikely. They were probably still worried about what he might do abroad. Could he link up with Yang Hu and Jin? Could he stir up trouble for them from another state?
So they kept an eye on him.
The sources suggest they maintained some kind of secret intelligence network to monitor his movements. Even in exile, they weren't taking chances.
Wow. So this whole period is just packed. The rise, the reforms, the moral stands, the betrayal, the dismissal.
It's a really dramatic arc covering his peak influence and its rapid collapse, driven by these complex political forces and his own unwavering principles.
Which leads us right back to that question. Could he have played it differently? Was there any path through that Lu political maze that might have led to success for his goals there?
It's the big what if, isn't it?
Yeah.
Something for you, the listener, to really mull over, thinking about the constraints and choices he faced.
A great question. So just to wrap up this part, we've seen this really tumultuous end to Confucius's official career in Lu. A clear clash, really, between his ideals and the harsh realities of power politics.
Absolutely. And his story doesn't end here, of course. Next time, we'll follow him out of Lu and Qi as he begins his longer travels, visiting various states. New challenges, new stories await.
Looking forward to that. And one final thought for you to consider, building on what we've discussed, that tension between personal integrity and political expediency. It's timeless, isn't it? When, if ever, might compromising ideals be justified? And what are the long-term costs for individuals and for society? Something to think about. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. Until next time.
Thanks for joining us.